Okay, it's 9 o'clock and it's time for us to rock and roll on my personal favorite webinar topic of this year, which is the personnel webinar. Real quickly, I gotta tell you a 30-second story. Steve and I spent a week yesterday interviewing potential law clerk hires to work for KSB. It's like speed dating for baby lawyers. They all come in and they all get 20 minutes. And over again, several of the kids would ask, what is it? Obviously, you and Steve love what you do. What is it about school law that is so different than other areas of the law? And I said, it's because we have great clients and we make a difference and da-da-da. And it's in the personnel context that it is most clear to me how important good, solid legal training is for you guys and where we really make a difference. We're going to talk today about getting rid of bad teachers. I don't want to do that in an offensive way, or when I talk about this teacher being a dork, or this teacher not being good enough to be a duke, or whatever we're going to say. It's not that I hate teachers. It's that I hate the idea that we should trap our kids in classrooms with bad teachers. And I don't care if that makes the NSEA mad. I believe that I believe the entire education community is stronger when we empower administrators to do their jobs well, to make teachers better. And so that's what we're going to do today. The focus is going to be how to empower you all to know what the statutes say, how to do good, solid evaluations, and when necessary, how to encourage someone to find opportunities someplace other than your school district. So before we get going too far, lawyers ruin all the fun, and I hate this slide every time we put it up there, but we're supposed to do it. We only represent school districts. We don't represent any of you individually. If any of you get a DUI, I can't get you out of jail. If we represent the entity. This is technically not legal advice. It's just educational materials. Lawyers are no fun. Rates may vary. We've fiddled around with a lot of different ways to give feedback during these webinars. One of the things you've heard me say over and over again is really important to me that these webinars are good. I think this has turned out to be the best way to ask us questions. And when we send a survey out at the end of the school year, this is one of the questions I'm going to ask you guys, if you think this is the best way, or if you want us to go back to poll everywhere or something else. But for today, if you've got questions, text any one of us. We will all be checking our texts, and then we'll ask the question out loud. So there's my number, there's Steve's number. Bobby's still, South Dakota boy, so his looks a little bit different. But shoot a text to all three of us or any single one of us, and we'll get your questions answered. We really like it when you have questions. It lets us know that you haven't fallen asleep, that you're not, watching YouTube videos on the side. And it's also more useful, I think, to everybody else to hear the questions that other folks have. So here's our game plan for today. We wanted to start out with just a little bit of something that's not the typical evaluation and remediation stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about some First Amendment issues and what to do if you love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump and just can't stop yourself from talking about it at school. And then we're going to roll into the classic teacher improvement stuff. So we'll start with non-renewal, then we'll talk about termination. For those two sections, it would be awesome if you had somewhere within your brain your evaluation instrument, whether you brought it in hard copy to the unit if you're at the unit, or if you have it available on your Google Drive. There's just a couple things in those two sections that we're going to specifically refer to in your evaluation instrument that it might be useful to you to have a chance to take a peek at it. Then we're going to talk about improvement plans, reprimands, and putting people on leave. I think this is the most misunderstood part of the improvement process, so we're going to spend some good time there. Cancellation, if we do anything, give anything a short shrift, I think it's going to be cancellation. I don't want to spend too much time on it, since cancellation is usually you slept with a kid, you stole money, you came to school stoned. Usually the lawyers are more involved right from the beginning, and it's not as long of a process. We got, I think, 2 slides on RIF. With the weirdness of the unicameral and the school finance stuff, we wanted to at least remind you what RIF is, that it's out there, and how it's different than the other stuff we're talking about. And then we're going to finish up by telling you how to renew your staff's contracts and some of the traps to avoid in that process. I think we'll have to keep moving pretty quickly to get through all of this by noon, but I would rather give you too much information than have it like drag on. So that's the game plan. We'll take a bathroom break probably about every hour. That's another question I want to ask you guys when the time comes. But it feels to me like if I'm drinking coffee all morning, I need to pee about once an hour. So I think that's what we're gonna do. We'll see how the day goes. With all that said, we're going to make Bobby begin because nothing makes Bobby happier than talking about how teachers really should have no First Amendment rights.
Yes, and moving on from your bathroom habits. Okay, so we entitled this section Welcome to 2020 because we are here, full force. We have the privilege of talking to boards. Steve and I have done a couple of board workshops with some ESUs recently. We get Karen and I and Steve, everybody here enjoys coming and talking to school staffs about these issues, and in particular, in an election year. We are already starting to get calls about social media posts, so we figured that we would just launch right into it. For those of you that watch the State of the Union, you know that Rush Limbaugh was given the most prestigious civilian award possible in the United States, which of course sparked all sorts of Twitter controversy and everything else. Well, now put yourself in the position of this principal in Wisconsin who gets a whole bunch of screenshots from patrons because one of your teachers said that Rush Limbaugh's cancer diagnosis was awesome and that he hoped the death was slow and painful as a result. So what are you going to do in that situation? And what we know so far is that that teacher was placed on some sort of whatever the equivalent probably of administrative leave is in Wisconsin. But it begs the question of all of that stuff that may happen out there in the universe when, you know, they've had a couple of Bud Light seltzers on a Saturday night. What is it that they can say that may give you some authority to impose disciplinary consequences? And just as importantly, when you have to say, now we can't really handle that with something like a termination, even a reprimand. And Stephen is going to walk through just a quick reminder on those cases later. So this stuff is already happening. This is happening in Nebraska. We've had calls already this semester about election-related, politic-related stuff. It's going to be, I think, particularly important when you have classes that are talking about these issues. And so that's another one where I think teachers often get confused. And so when we go out and present to staffs, we remind them of the requirements in Rule 27 that they don't conflate their personal views with those of the school, right? Because that would be unprofessional conduct. That would be unethical behavior. But knowing exactly where to draw that line is really significant for you to kind of remind them of what's in your policies. Our policy service subscribers, and I'm sure the other services out there, have policies on things like use of district social media accounts, what you can say, discussing controversial and political issues in class, and just the sort of stuff that is protected and not protected by the First Amendment. It also applies to administrators. This is the big thing to remember, right? The First Amendment isn't different for the superintendent than it is for a part-time substitute activity bus driver. Everybody is covered by the First Amendment the same. So this is a principal, after the news of Kobe Bryant's death surfaced on that Sunday a few weeks back, who went online and posted, not gonna lie, seems to me that karma caught up with a rapist today. Exploring it a little bit further and kind of waiting for some of the stuff to come out, it was really interesting because when we read these articles, we can see the lawyering happening in the background. So the next thing that comes out was a personal apology. The principal says, this is a personal. Note the personal, not school-related, school-affiliated, I'm not speaking for the school type of stuff. Because as lawyers, we often say, go in and tell that staff member, if you're going to say that and it's going to piss off the community, you need to understand that they have to be able to differentiate between when you're speaking personally and when you're not. So she apologizes, I made a bad choice. They had her send out a full-throated letter of apology to all patrons and students and stakeholders, in which she said, I should never say that a person's death is deserved. This was based on a personal experience of mine. So maybe she had a history of some sort of sexual assault, sexual violence. I apologize. Well, what comes out 2 days later? Once that momentum starts down the track, it can be too late. And so what we have in a lot of these cases, again, is the difference between what you can and can't do. But that is never going to answer the question politically fully. So you end up having a principal that resigns because of a social media post clearly made on a Sunday, not while she was on duty. And that's the sort of stuff that we get calls on, and that's covered by the First Amendment.
Thank you, sir. Before we get into the case, I mean, essentially what we're going to look at is what hat are the people wearing when they say what they say. And that's really the main distinction you have to look at. If they are wearing their teacher hat or their administrator hat or their employee hat, they don't have any First Amendment protections. If they're speaking as a private citizen, they do have some, but there's going to be a balancing test between the interest of the employee to have First Amendment rights versus the school's interest of having an efficient operation and making sure their speech doesn't interfere with your operations. So the first case that came out was the Pickering case. This was a school teacher who was unhappy with the school board's decision to try to raise taxes. And so wrote a letter to the editor. Didn't go over very well at the board. They fired Mr. Pickering. And this gets all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the key here is if he's speaking as a private citizen on a matter of public concern, the district must show it had an adequate justification for treating the employee differently from any other member of the public. So essentially, if they're not wearing their teacher hat and it's a matter of public concern. So for example, they come in to a school board meeting, that's as a private citizen, and they talk about taxes being too high or curriculum or things of that nature, that is a matter of public concern. Now, if he shows up and says, I don't get paid enough and this is crap and I can't believe they assigned me to be the coach when I don't want to be the coach, obviously not speaking on a matter of public concern, they're looking in their own private interest. So if they're speaking as a citizen on a matter of public concern, essentially we have a balancing test. They do have some First Amendment rights, but even then, if they say something that is so outrageous and extreme that 200 people flood your office on Monday, you may have cause to terminate their employment anyway because it's disrupted your operations. So that, again, just a balancing test there. The Garcetti case is the other side of the coin when you're speaking while wearing your teacher or employee hat. When employees make statements pursuant to their official duties, it does not insulate their communication from employer discipline. And the example here was Mr. Garcetti was a deputy district attorney, thought that his side was maybe fabricating some affidavits or wasn't playing by the rules, went to his boss and said, hey, these aren't right. And the boss said, too bad, I like them how they are, let's go with them. Instead of taking that and just doing what he was told, Mr. Garcetti revealed that information to the defense attorneys and then ultimately got subpoenaed and had to testify. The court said he was wearing his employee hat when he made those statements. So he had no protections whatsoever. The district's attorney's office was free to discipline him in any way that they wanted to do. And I think now Karen is going to talk to you about non-renewal.
This is the time of year to get real serious in asking yourself the following question. That probationary teacher that I'm not quite sure about, is he going to be excellent in 5 years? Not, can I live through, if we assign him to title, maybe nobody will complain. If we move him to the kindergarten class, those parents aren't as demanding. The question is, will the probationary teacher that you're working with now, will they be excellent in 5 years? And if the answer is no, and then you need to ask yourself a second question, which is our district okay with that? And I don't mean that as a shot. I get calls, we all get calls all the time that say, she's not awesome, but she's ag. He's kind of struggling, but he's science. And so we're going to invest and try to really work hard to bring him along. But if you've got somebody that you're not sure about, I would highly encourage you to think about whether or not they are going to be excellent someday. Now, every teacher has continuing contract rights. Turn to the person next to you real quickly, just say to him or her quietly, every teacher has continuing contract rights. Okay, good job. Here's why I say that. There is sort of a confusion out there that sort of seems to think it is tenured teachers who have continuing contract rights and somehow probies are almost employed at will. And all you have to do is tell a probationary teacher, sorry, it's not working out, and off they go. The continuing contract laws, the legal standards are different, and we'll talk about that, but the continuing contract laws apply with equal force to probationary and tenured teachers. Yes,
Wait,
Mr. Truitt.
but Karen, our board has to say we're renewing the contract just like they do the superintendents, right?
So those of you that have the board do this ritual, we renew all of the teacher staff, all the teacher contracts. That does nothing other than, if you do it before April 15th, make it sooner when they get a new contract.
But Karen, in our December board meeting, it says in my contract, the board has to renew my contract. So what if the board doesn't do that?
The superintendent's contract renews on April 15th or any earlier time that's stated in contract. Principals contracts renew April 15th unless the contract requires the board to do it sooner. April 15th is the magic day for everybody, unless you've done something which, in our opinion, as a district's attorney, is stupid, which is to bind yourself sooner. But on April 15th, everybody's dancing with each other for one more year. Now, one of the things, so that's number one, the most common misperception I think we get is that somehow the dates are different for probationary teachers, or there's floating dates, or March 15th is sometimes out there in people's minds. April 15th is the day for everything, for tenured, proby, RIF, administrators, everybody, April 15th, unless you promise an earlier date in some way, shape, or form. Number one. Number two, the other thing that makes people confused is the idea that somehow we could buy ourselves some more time, they could agree to extend it out or something like that. Nope, April 15th is the day, and that day applies with equal force to the teacher as well as the administration. Again, unless your board has, foolishly in my opinion, told teachers they can have longer. Just like the board can tell the superintendent, we promise that we'll renew your contract on December 15th. If the board says to teachers, you can get out until June 1st, the teachers aren't bound until June 1st. But if you take away the board saying that and giving them the extra time, April 15th, everybody's dancing for another year. So that April 15th date I love it in its simplicity. April 15th is the day. I am fascinated by how confusing it becomes to people when you get yourself twisted up. So April 15th is your magic day. So non-renewal, if you want the NSEA UniServ rep to think that you know what you're talking about, you need to make sure you use the right terminology. One of the things we do when we bring a baby lawyer into KSB, it's very common for people to sort of think non-renewal and termination and cancellation, that those terms are basically interchangeable. All three of those words mean you're getting fired, so it doesn't matter which word you use. Do understand legally it matters a lot, but more importantly for your purposes, it makes you sound like you don't know what you're doing if you use the wrong term. And I think UniServ reps who don't necessarily know what they're doing in these matters anyway, they draw wrong conclusions if you use the wrong terminology. So it's important to me that you use the right terminology. So non-renewal only deals with discharge of a probationary certificated employee at the end of the current contract year. Your classroom management isn't very good, Mrs. 8th grade teacher. We're gonna let you teach at the year, and then we're gonna have you find another job. A probationary employee is defined in the statute as a certificated staff member who served less than 3 full-time equivalent years, and only 0.5 and greater count. So if I come on in my first year as a English teacher and I just pick up 2 classes because somebody's on a shortened schedule because they're getting chemotherapy, 2 out of 8 classes would not be 5 FTE, 0.5 FTE. So that whole first year will never count towards my tenure. If the next year I become a full-time teacher, at the end of that second year, I have 1 year towards towards tenure, not 1 whatever 2/8 is. I can do that math, 1/4, right? Stop laughing at me. Years at 0.8 FTE or greater count towards 1, and tenure only begins after you finish that 3rd year. So if I come in as an English teacher at 0.6 and I work 0.6 in year 1, 0.6 in year 2, 0.6 in year 3, I do not get tenure until I've finished my 5th year, because that's when I will add up to 3 FTE. It's not it's not when during the school year that I get to that, it's at the end of that school year.
Start of the next contract.
Yeah, at the start of the next contract year. So again, April 15th is April 15th of the year in which I will be at 3 FTE. That's your deadline as the administrator to say, is she gonna get tenure or is she gonna go and do something else? We get calls on this. Don't feel bad if you call to double check. I like telling you guys this math, but I also would really encourage you, before you draw a conclusion, talk it through with your school's lawyer just to make sure. This is a smart phone call that, is gonna cost your district, whatever, $100 and possibly save them, thousands in a personnel hearing. We rattle this off when we talk to you guys about probationary employees, and we don't always put the exact statutory language in front of you. So here's what it says. The board may elect to amend or not renew the contract of a probationary employee for any reason it deems sufficient. So that's where you get the idea that they're employed at will. But look at the next phrase. If such non-renewal is not for constitutionally impermissible reasons, so it can't be because she's old, she's disabled, he's weird, and gay, we think. You know what I mean? Those protected employment statuses are where we get nervous about the constitutionally permissible reasons. And if the non-renewal is in accordance with all of the statutes that we're going to talk about next, okay? So any reason the board deems sufficient if constitutional and if you followed all the rules for non-renewal, okay? I love this. I can't take credit for this. This is Steve's hilarious title, and I dig it a lot. So
I'm allergic to Steve's humor.
This subsection 1 is just what we talked about when we said April 15th. See how a probationary employee has continuing contract unless we do something, right? It automatically renews unless you recommend that the board take action not to renew them.
Superintendents, this is always you.
Yes.
So I get a call from the board president. Well, we got to decide, are we going to give him that extra year or not this December? And I say something like, he or she gets that extra year unless you hand them the notice that we're talking about. This whole, the board votes to extend it by a year doesn't matter. And it doesn't really matter how your contract is written. It will renew if the board doesn't give notice by either April 15th or the date of your contract. Superintendents are just like teachers in this regard. We have to stop training boards to think that they've got to make some huge monumentous decision about whether to renew. It's just a lot of political stuff that doesn't really get you anywhere because the statute applies to safety. So anyway.
Yes. No, I like this. The continuing contract laws are like a perpetual motion machine, right? It keeps going unless somebody does something to stop it. Otherwise, the assumption is everybody's going to continue on the way they have been continuing on. So that's the first thing. There's the idea that continuing contract does apply to probates. But look at that second bullet point. Purpose of the period is to allow you an opportunity to evaluate, grade, assess, fabulous, and assist the employee's professional skills and work performance. Two things I want to draw your attention to. Number one, this does not mean that a probationary teacher needs a 7-month improvement plan and that you have to send them to Marzano training for whatever, $6,000 in Chicago or whatever. You know, it doesn't have to be elaborate, but you do have to give the teacher some assistance in figuring out how he or she can get better. So that's the first thing. Doesn't have to be elaborate, but you do have to provide some assistance. But number two, notice that it doesn't say here, and it's on you, Ms. Principal, to make the teacher get better, right? You are assisting the employee in improving his or her professional skills and work performance. So that does not mean that you have to be in their classroom every 20 minutes saying, did you post a learning objective? Do you have a seating chart? Did you use proximity control? It means you say to the employee, you might think about proximity, you should definitely have a seating chart, you have to post a learning objective, and then it's on them to decide whether they're going to take that or not. So I see two mistakes happening in this area of probationary employees. The first mistake is they just tell the teacher, basically, you suck, you're at will, you're a probationary teacher, see ya. And that's not what your obligation is. You are required to give them some assistance. So that's the first mistake. But the second mistake I see is at the other end of the spectrum, and this one's actually more common, where you take on too much responsibility for making the teacher better. This is not a special education child that needs specialized instruction. This is an employee who you are expected to tell them what to do, and then they are expected to implement it. And I think we're turning remediation plans almost into IEPs for employees that just aren't good enough. And so I want to disabuse you of that notion that you have to do everything that you can to make them better. So where do these requirements come from? It's interesting to me that the statute actually isn't too bad. Rule 10 is where they've added in some of the more the adjectives that make things more specific. But where districts really shoot themselves in the foot is in your board policies. And as we sit here right now, if you can, you pull up your board policy on evaluation of probationary teachers and just make sure that your board has not put a bunch of stuff into policy that isn't required. And if they have, understand that you have a higher standard than everybody else in the state. Let me give you a quick example. Oh wait, Steve wants to say something.
I've got to jump in here. Somebody in this state is giving you guys the idea that you have to put best practice into policy.
No, yes, hear him.
It is a horrible idea from a legal perspective. That is great if you want to operate under best practices. That's fantastic. What board policy does is sets the floor.
Yes.
Okay, if you set it higher, you have to comply with those higher requirements. So don't put in board policy that you're going to evaluate them once a week.
Yes.
No, it's once every semester for a probationary employee. Don't promise anything more. Do you want to do more because you think that's best practice and it makes you a better district? Fantastic, do it, but do not put it in your policy. There is this thing nationally and statewide about best practice, best practice. That's great for operations. It is horrible for policy decisions. So please just keep that in mind.
I cannot reinforce that enough. And nothing makes me madder than somebody that sits in a nice, quiet office for 8 hours a day and then goes home and has a glass of wine and thinks about how awesome life is, telling you who has the phone ringing starting at 7 o'clock and you're doing basketball supervision till midnight. And then you go home and start figuring out what the board packet's going to look like for the next board meeting. Don't let them tell you that you're not working hard enough. Yeah. I believe in best practice. I believe in doing doing the level best you can to improve education, but do not put that into board policy. It's like this. We all agree that you should exercise 30 minutes a day. You should eat 5 fruits and vegetables every day, and that you should limit your sugar and alcohol consumption. That's best practice. Would you be willing to sign a contract that says, I do not have the ability to receive medical treatment unless I do all of that every single day? No, because you know you're not going to always hit the mark perfectly. And what board policy that sets best practice into policy does is they say, you can't go to the doctor unless you've exercised for 30 minutes every single day for the last 3 years. It's not gonna happen. Here's the bare minimum. So what we have on these next few slides are the statutory minimums. If your policy has something more than that, you're gonna have to do what the policy says. So you have to do an observation and an evaluation at least once each semester. But Karen, we think it's better to have at least 2 observations per semester for a probationary teacher. You remember what it was like to be a first-year teacher. You had no clue what you were doing. Awesome. Go in there every 20 minutes if you want. I don't care. Put it in policy that you're going to do it at least once each semester because that's your bare minimum. It's kind of weird to have full instructional period for some particular positions. Now, we've addressed this. Almost all the policies I see now do define what a full instructional period is for a teacher. Usually it says at least 20 minutes because that's the smallest increment for kind of the, at least when I was in education college, they said little kids could only pay attention for about 20 minutes at a time. So whatever your, some policies say 40. But whatever your policy says for the minutes, that's what you're going to do for the classroom. But then you also need to think about what about the folks that don't actually do instruction, media specialists, counselors, nurses, and that sort of thing. This is a trap for a couple of reasons. Number one, if it says you're going to observe a probationary teacher or a probationary certificated staff member for at least 40 minutes, that means you're going to have to hang out in the nurse's office for about 40 minutes unless the policy says something else. And the other reason it's a trap is if that nurse goes in and does a class period on, when kids get their, like the 4th grade, like reproduction unit, if he or she does any instruction, you need to be watching them do the instruction, even if that isn't their primary duty. So if they do any classroom stuff at all, you need to get the observation done of the classroom stuff. Now you can do other stuff in addition, but you need to at least do the classroom stuff. I laugh here because it says use specific district defined evaluation criteria that include specified domains. I'm laughing because in my mind, I can see your Danielson and your Marzano instruments, which have, I think Marzano's up to 47 effective practices. Danielson has, I think, even more. And I can just in my mind see the evaluation instrument that you've all brought with you that has all of these different criteria, right? Engagement, scanning for learning, predicting, learning objectives, da, 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 da. Here's all you're required to have. 3 things. So I'm not saying Danielson and Marzano are wrong. I'm saying, look how much best practice has layered onto you. You're required by the rule to evaluate 3 things: their instructional performance, their classroom organization and management, their personal and professional conduct. Now, I would argue that really, if I had the time and the just inclination to do it, I would really love to organize the Danielson and Marzano rubrics underneath those 3 headings. Because I think what you've got is a more detailed efficacy for instructional performance and classroom management, but they all kind of fall under those 2. But really, those 3 domains are the only thing that you're required to evaluate. If I were you, I would highlight that personal professional conduct, and here's why. We get all the time the call that says, you know, when she's in the classroom, bell to bell, she's pretty good. In the teacher's lounge, she's a bitch. Kids hate her. She won't return parent emails. Or she's a mess. You know, I found her crying in her car yesterday morning because she's so unhappy here. But, you know, once the bell rings and she's in front of the kids, she does okay. What you're telling me is that she's okay in 2 domains, but she's not hitting it in that 3rd domain. And there's nothing illegitimate about that. You don't have to feel bad for saying, this is a small staff, you don't fit in here. Or, you know, you have not been able to develop positive and supporting relationships with parents and other members of the community. Because that is, not only is that permitted, that is one of the required domains that you have to evaluate people under. So that's, if any of you ask for the KSB evaluation form, it has 3 boxes. It has these 3 domains, and then it says meets, does not meet for each of them. That's it. Because I don't think you should have to spend 45 minutes reading the instrument before you start filling it out. So you're required to evaluate using these domains. Now, here's the stuff that you have to give the employee when you've done the evaluation. A written list of deficiencies. That does not mean it has to be a freestanding document, okay? That can be in the evaluation, if you mark needs improvement or does not meet standards, that can count as your written list of deficiencies. Concrete suggestions for improvement, which Rule 10 requires also to be in writing. But again, this does not have to be, sometimes I see principals, especially young principals, kind of feeling overwhelmed. Like I'd have to start at the very beginning and write her lesson plan for her from start to finish. This is just, like I said before, things like have a seating chart, write your learning objective on the board every single day, use a bell ringer, have a closing activity, right? Those are all of that concrete lesson plan, do a lesson plan. Those are concrete suggestions for improvement. That's good enough to meet this requirement. And you need to include, but what you have to have is a connection between what you've identified as a deficiency and the suggestion for improvement. So your classroom is chaotic and poorly managed. That's because you don't have all the materials ready to go and you're getting organized, and while you do that, the kids are getting ramped up. Therefore, you have to do a lesson plan every day, and that has to include in writing all the materials that you need to gather before class starts. So there has to be linkage between all that stuff. One of the things that the NSCA kind of complains about when they see that we've helped you write an improvement plan, which Bobby's going to talk about, there's nothing illegitimate about that at all. But one of the things they complain about is if they perceive that this is just a cut and paste job and it doesn't have any connection to this teacher's deficits. I make no apologies that I include lesson planning in a lot of the plans I help put together, because I think good lesson planning is vital to good instruction. And maybe that's just based on my own experience. I needed to do that when I was in a classroom 30 years ago. But so I don't feel bad that we have lesson planning on a lot of staff members, but don't cut and paste lesson planning into an improvement plan if what your problem with the teacher is that she's not nice to parents. Because then it looks like you're just piling a bunch of make work on her just to try to force her to leave. And that's not what the purpose of this is, right? The purpose of this should be to help this person get better. So concrete list of deficiencies, concrete suggestions for improvement, adequate timeline for implementing the concrete suggestions for improvement. I got to tell you a quick story. My very first Pro-V non-renewal was a gal that had homeschooled her kids, raised her kids, and gone back to school, gotten her teaching credential, and now she's in the school. And she did, some of you have heard this story about this lady, because she's like, you know, it's always the best for your first. So she just was inappropriate with kids. She talked about how the melted ice cream was her favorite part because it was the spermy part. She talked about wrapping herself in saran wrap and meeting her husband at the front door. And if you met this lady, that would be even more disturbing to you than I'm saying it is right now. She talked about how boys were full of warm marshmallow cream. Just inappropriate. Stuff that she shouldn't be saying. So my very first hearing, it's also the principal, his very first hearing. I think it's his first year as a principal, might be his second year, but he and I are both kind of figuring out this non-renewal stuff as we go. And so I have all my questions written out, and he does a fabulous job. On cross-examination, the question that the UniServ rep asks my principal is, when you told Mrs. So-and-so to stop talking dirty in class, what timeline did you give her for improvement? Because he hadn't written and therefore stop in 2 days, right? I mean, it hadn't occurred to either one of us to put a timeline on there. And to tell you the honest truth, I had not read all of Rule 10, which is a lesson, another lesson I learned from this hearing is read the entire rule before you do anything with it. I just had missed it. So they asked the question, the principal's flashing me the freaked out eyes. You know, he kind of stumbles around and says, no, I didn't write down a timeline for improvement. And he turns back to me and looks at me like, okay, girl, save me. And just because God is good to me or I don't know, somehow I flashed to say to him, how quickly should a teacher be able to know that they shouldn't talk about sex with kids? And my principal was good enough that he looked at me and said, immediately. So the timeline was immediate. Yes, ma'am. Boom, done, right? So the point of that story is when it says an adequate timeline for implementing the changes, that doesn't have to be 6, 8, 10 weeks, depending on what the problem is. If it is you need a seating chart, you can do that tonight. That should be done by tomorrow. If it is stop talking about inappropriate content with kids, if you tell her that at 10 o'clock in the morning, the 11 o'clock class period, she should have had adequate time to know, oh, I shouldn't do this anymore. But you do have to have an adequate timeline. For some of the stuff, like, you know, engage more active learning, higher level Bloom's taxonomy, I like to say, and I'll be back in your classroom in the next 3 weeks and see if you're implementing it. I like giving them that kind of time. You're supposed to give them follow-up evaluations and assistance, but notice if you do a first semester evaluation that says you're not getting it done, and you do a second semester evaluation that says you're not getting it done, boom, we've done a follow-up evaluation that would be sufficient to meet the statutory requirements. If you're saying to yourself, wait a second, what do you mean I have to do a follow-up evaluation? This is where this comes from in the statute. The evaluator will also provide the probationary employee with follow-up evaluations and assistance when deficiencies are made. In a perfect world, I love to do a couple first semester and 1 second semester evaluation. Then I think we've met this in spades. But when I'm trying to put into policy the bare minimum, 2 evaluations will get it done as long as we identify deficits in both evaluations. So.
One more quick point on that. This is also why if you have an evaluation process that takes forever,
Yes.
right? 2, 3 observations, at least 5 informals. If your policy makes it way more difficult to do a follow-up evaluation, that is your fault, right? That what that means is you've just made it harder to comply with this part of the statute, which candidly, the union's going to point to every time because it's going to be, well, you did 1 in September and you did 1 in March. There's nothing in between. You got to have a good answer for that, right? And it can't be, well, because this evaluation instrument I was saddled with really sucks and takes me 10 hours of, principal power to get it done.
The other thing you'll note here, click backwards one, will you? It doesn't say 2 formatives and a summative. That whole formative summative evaluation system, look, I'm fine with it. I don't dislike it. I kind of like the summative as the ritual time for the principal to say, I'm going to tell the superintendent that I'm not going to support your reemployment. But that's really 3 evaluations, and it's certainly not required to have 2 formatives and a summative. We've saddled ourselves with that in policy and in some of the other stuff that's out there.
Yeah. I'm teaching a class to people who are aspiring, teachers that are aspiring principals, and one of the things the textbook says is, one of the most difficult things you will have to come to terms with as a principal is that the ideals of evaluation are great, but the core concept of why we have an evaluation rubric that is in every state statute is because you have to prove a legally sufficient case to fire teachers. Like, it just owns it, right? You go from the classroom to being a principal, you need to start conceptualizing it differently. And I don't care who is upset at us for saying that. That just is the truth, right? So I was a little bit relieved that the textbook that we're using says, hey, when you're a new principal, you just got to understand, think about the purpose. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be helping teachers. So the Cox case is one that we always start with because it has a parade of horribles that we're going to touch on as we go through here. Ms. Cox was a first-year band teacher in McCool Junction, was not formally evaluated first semester. However, there were a whole bunch of pissed off students at the end of the first semester. Why? Because they did the same thing that happened in my high school when they implemented writing across the curriculum, which was you have to have some sort of end of semester test or essay or something in every class in this school. So my band and vocal teacher decided that we should write an essay on why we chose the songs that we sang at the district music contest. My buddies and I picked What Would You Do with a Drunken Sailor? So we had all sorts of fun mocking this. We have to have a semester evaluation sort of thing at every single class in the school to improve writing skills. I get the concept, but that's functionally what happened here. So the band teacher gives a written test to the band students at the end of the first semester. They all complain to the principal. Principal says to the teacher, did you give this written test? And she says, yes. He says, that's good. You were required to. So what we have is a little bit of disconnect, I think, between the principal and the teacher. But needless to say, what happens in so many of these cases, Bobby, they're not very good. Mass exodus from our band and vocal programs.
Yes.
We have half the kids have told me they're not going out next year. So the principal says to the teacher, hey, you got a problem here. And the teacher's like, it's because you made me give a semester test. No first semester evaluation whatsoever. First time fully observed was January 28th. There were informal observations in the first semester, but the first semester evaluation instrument, right, the one that said basically, you know, all of the different things that you're required to put in an evaluation, the act of legal significance didn't occur until January 28th. You probably see where this case is going. It did have stuff in there that would have been sufficient to non-renew the contract of a probationary teacher. Needed to improve communication with students, with other staff members and with parents, and needed to use positive reinforcement when appropriate because some students felt that the teacher was a bit terse. Even if that's all you had, it's not great, right? But there's an argument that's legally sufficient. Their problem is that it is undisputed, the Nebraska Supreme Court says, that Cox did not receive the list of deficiencies and suggestions for improvement. In other words, she was not evaluated in the strict legal sense. And because she was not evaluated one time, she could not have possibly then been given these follow-up evaluations and assistance for the deficiencies. So if you skip the first semester evaluation, you got two problems, right? You missed the core requirement in the statute, and you can't provide follow-up evaluations in the first semester and assistance when you don't do an evaluation whatsoever. So again, must be based on actual classroom observation for an entire instructional period. It's not like NDE dreamt that up, that's in the statute. So Cox, the Board of Education in this case loses because the principal did not comply with the strict requirements of the statute. The other thing that happened here, which we'll come back to in a second, I just want to footnote real quickly. What did they do in March? Gave everybody on the board agenda, right, renewal of teacher contracts. Who was missing? Ms. Cox. The York News Times was there and said, you know, that new band teacher isn't on your list. And the principal turns all red in the face, I assume, and says, yeah, I know. And so she gets a notice of non-renewal in April. That's one of the reasons that we're going to tell you, Steve will tell you at the end, you shouldn't do this big, long parade of ceremonial, renewals of contract. That happens by statute. So here's the process. It's not that complicated. It's from the same statute that Karen talked about before. If the board or superintendent, right, decides this teacher needs to be non-renewed, you must give them written notice of that. Bobby, in their evaluation instrument, there's a little box that says, do I recommend or not recommend renewal? I check the I don't recommend renewal box. Is that legally sufficient? Maybe, I don't know. I certainly don't think so, because what the union expects is you have to give them a letter that says in writing.
Are you the superintendent or the superintendent's designee? And the answer is no.
Yeah. So again, it requires Bobby. I told her her contract wasn't renewed for next year. My answer is that's great. Awesome. So she'll know that our notice letter is coming, right? Have to provide written notice. The school then in that subsection 4, you can see there, that's what Karen talked about earlier, has to be for constitutionally permissible reasons, has to comply with the processes we talked about. That was the Cox case issue. And we can't just tell them, right? If we skip any of these steps, not going to be legally sufficient. They have to send a request for a hearing within 7 calendar days if they want one. So in theory, what we usually do is schedule out 7 calendar days and then usually 9 or 10 further in case they say, oh, I dropped it in the mail at midnight on day 7. So you may receive it later, but it's got to be sent within 7 calendar days. This one is important, number 6. Prior to the scheduling of a hearing, right, or the board taking action on that non-renewal, the name of the employee and the fact that this process is happening must remain confidential. So Bobby, what exactly can I tell the board? The answer is, we have a teacher that has been given a notice. I will keep you posted, right? We've got a memo that we recommend you send to your board, but you can't go around telling people, can we advertise for the position? Probably you're running the risk of, right, not knowing exactly what's going to happen. But Bobby, this is an ag teacher. You don't understand. There's one ag teacher and 13 openings in this state. Totally get it, right? But that fact has to remain confidential.
So let me just jump on to, everything he says is absolutely true. 2 things. Number 1, you can tell your board that you have notified a certificated staff member of possible non-renewal. Don't say who, don't say what the subject area is, but you can tell the board that you've noticed somebody up. That way, when the board gets accosted at the basketball game or at church, they're not caught quite so flat-footed. In fact, we now, when we do the notice letter, we send out a memo for the board just because we think that's best practice. Number 2, on advertising. So I don't even know who it was. Steve might know. Somebody years and years ago was in a personnel hearing. Superintendent had advertised the opening and I think hired the replacement before the board hearing on whether or not the teacher was going to be retained. And then I think it was Mark McGuire was cross-examining him and kind of made the superintendent look dumb for having hired the replacement before the teacher even got fired. And so the received wisdom in the education community became that there was some sort of, it was naughty. You can't advertise before the person gets fired. I disagree with that. If it's an ag teacher, you start advertising. I'm sorry, I know that's awkward for the teacher that's getting fired, but our number 1 job is to be meeting the needs of kids for the 2021 school year. But if this goes to hearing, we are going to have to be ready to give a coherent and cogent answer to the union lawyer when they start crossing you about something like, well, Mr. Superintendent, you didn't even wait for the board to act, did you? You're already telling the board that you expect them to fire her. You're blah, 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 blah. We can have an answer. You know what? I decided that if the board decides to keep this lady, she's so weak, we're going to need a co-teacher. So for at least 1 year, I wanted to have somebody else going with them. Or, you know what, we always have elementary openings. So I started advertising for an elementary staff member because I knew it was possible we'd have an opening someplace else. We can have an answer. So we just have to not be caught flat-footed. That's my take on it.
And the teacher's going to be applying.
Yeah.
The union says as soon as they get notice, they need to start applying. So it's good for the goose, good for the gander. And number 8, you have to give a hearing that meets the requirements, not of formal due process, but it starts to pretty much look like a formal due process hearing. There's not a huge distinction between the non-renewal and termination processes, as we'll talk about. This is the other big one that we want to point out. What you'll notice is at any time after they've been given notice, but before the board comes out of its deliberation and adopts its findings saying we non-renew the teacher, that teacher can resign. Notice that there is no provision in here but what if we spent a bunch of legal fees because we were preparing for the hearing, and then this teacher got that job 6 hours away, and so then just 2 days before the hearing dropped out? Can we go after her or him for all the legal fees and preparing for it? And the answer is, I'm sorry, you cannot, right? They have the right to resign through the non-renewal process. So notice by April 15th, 7 days to send that hearing request. Notice of the basis for non-renewal, witnesses and all that go out 5 days before the hearing. We call that the 5-day notice letter, and tells them basically this is what you're going to get. Does the union have to give anything in return? And the answer is no. They can show up, they can call as many parents as they want, they can call as many students as they want, they can put on whatever case they want. There's no coming back, or there's no requirement that they inform us what their strategy is, but we've got to lay out our case at least 5 days before the hearing. It must be confidential, conducted before the board within 30 days of the request, which is a date that typically speaking, we can't extend out with agreement of the parties, and that happens for scheduling purposes. This is an informal hearing, but it's really pretty formal. Discuss and explain the position on continuing employment is what the statute says. But it looks a lot more like a trial than it does a discussion and explanation about why the contract should or shouldn't be renewed. The board can make a decision for any reason except an unconstitutional one. A majority of a quorum is sufficient. So if we have 4 board members there at that meeting and 3 vote to non-renew, that teacher is non-renewed, right? We got a quorum present. We got a majority of the quorum that voted for a non-renewal. That will be different when we talk about termination and cancellation. And again, the employee may resign at any time. The final decision in these cases, which is really interesting if you think about it, we have to give them notice by April 15th, but the board has to make a decision by May 15th, which means if they take the full 7 days and then drop the hearing request in the mail, and you get that 9 days later, right? What you've really got is from April 24th to May 15th to get this hearing done, unless the union agrees to extend that May 15th deadline, which they usually do because they understand they have scheduling issues too, but they don't have to.
All right, before we go on to the next one, we actually have a question. Going back to the First Amendment issue, and this is something Bobby and I have been presenting on here recently. A teacher uses a personal Twitter account to post political opinions and cartoons, etc. during school hours. It violates our expectations for staff members, but can the school reprimand the teacher for making the offensive political posts as well? There are a lot of laws you have to look at to actually answer this question, not just the First Amendment, but accountability and disclosure issues. Rule 27 is an unprofessional. Bottom line, it sounds like they're on school time, so they're wearing their teacher hat. And so I don't think they have any First Amendment protections. But what else are you allowing teachers to do during this time? Are they allowed to send other emails? Our favorite is we get sex party emails that go on, sent out to all staff. That's been a good one. But, selling the Girl Scout cookies, doing whatever. Are you allowing other staff members to send out those emails during that time period? The answer is yes. That could impact the analysis.
Policy.
What's that?
To give a policy that's specific.
Yeah, and if you have to have a policy that says what they can and can't do, and we strongly recommend that it indicate what they can use these electronic resources for. But accountability and disclosure, this could be considered a ballot issue or a candidate issue, which prohibits the use of school resources except for de minimis use. So this probably would be de minimis. But then we always come back to Rule 27. If depending on the type of post, it may be unprofessional. If people get into a little Donald Trump type fight, which we've had on an all staff email, it may be, okay, forget about all the other stuff. Maybe it passes muster there, but they definitely have been unprofessional, and there's things we can do to address that. So yeah, I think there we go. Okay. All right. So what are we looking at in the personnel process? We obviously look to see if you comply with all those statutory pieces that we just talked about. Rule 10, we look to see that you comply with that. We look at your board policy, and that's really where we have to focus, because Rule 10 and the statutes we're familiar with. Your board policy is where you start to throw in some funky things sometimes. We look at the improvement plans to see what was in there and has the teacher complied. Sometimes we get staff members who go, well, nothing we can do. We gave them that improvement plan and she did everything. What does that mean? Well, she read the books and she went to that class we sent her to. Great. Has her performance improved? No. Well, then she really hasn't completed the improvement plan. Just because they jumped through the hoops that are in there doesn't mean they necessarily have improved to the degree necessary to stick around.
And the union's argument is going to be, then you gave them a crappy plan if they did it all and didn't get better, right? So that's, again, to Karen's point about tying those
Which is why I say we should not make ourselves responsible for their improvement. That's, anyway, yeah.
I mean, at some point, did you lead them to the water? They got to drink it at some point. You do have to get them there, but they have to take responsibility at some point. We also look at the reprimands to see what issues had been raised through those and what you required them to do in the reprimands, if anything. So does your evaluation instrument or policy require improvement plans, meetings, things of that nature? Because as we said, again, improvement plans, a separate plan, not required. Did you promise meetings and then not hold them? Because that's part of the remediation process. So don't overpromise. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Are there timelines or even different types of evaluation instruments you're required to use? Again, this is where we look at Rule 10, and I think the next slide lays it out. But essentially the theory is you have to get your evaluation policy and your evaluation instrument approved by the Nebraska Department of Education. What often happens is it gets approved, and then you guys go and change it, which you absolutely can do, but what you have to do is resubmit it to the department. And so what often happens is the instrument and policy you're using is not the one that's on file with NDE. It at the very least raises an argument that you're using an invalid instrument and it doesn't count. We don't have a court that says that. I don't think it's going to go that far. I think as long as you comply with statutory requirements, you're going to be good. But it unnecessarily raises that argument, and they do raise it. And so
you're going to look bad in front of your board.
Yeah, and you're going to look silly because you don't know what your own policy is.
This is why I have started now, almost every personnel case that I think might go, I just email the department myself and get it. Don't be offended. It's not that I don't believe you. It's that I want to make damn sure that you look good if we're going to be in a gymnasium of 200 people defending your work.
All right, did you actually provide the employee with written reprimands and documentation listing deficiencies? Holy moly. So you will contact us, you jump through all the right hoops, you contact us, you're on top of it. We put together the reprimand that addresses everything. It tells them what you want them to do to fix these deficiencies. And we find out 2 months later, we'll say, send us the whole file, and you send it. And there's that beautiful reprimand that tells them, naughty, naughty, and here's what you have to do to fix it. And we said, great. And he gave that to her, and you go, no, thought it was kind of harsh. We thought we'd give her some more time. That kills it. Just kills it. Yeah, there's always some sob story. And I'll give you my best hearing experience. This was one of my first experiences, and I'll never forget. Rex Schulte was my hearing officer, and the look he gave me was unforgettable. So I have a superintendent/principal, and we prepare for the hearing. And he gave first a semester evaluation to a probationary teacher, first-year teacher, and a second semester evaluation. The evaluations were pretty much empty. They didn't, all the boxes were checked, but there were no comments, nothing that said anything was unsatisfactory, really. But they're in between, right around Christmas, was this wonderful 10-point document that laid out all of the problems and what the principal/superintendent wanted the employee to do to fix it. And when we were going to had everything in there you want. And I said, you gave this to her. He goes, yep, right there before Christmas. I said, oh, perfect. First semester, great. All right. And he followed up. Oh, yeah, we had meetings. So get him on the stand at the hearing. And said, here's exhibit 1. It's the evaluation. Here's exhibit 2. Here's the evaluation. Not a lot in there. Yeah, not a lot in there. Here's exhibit 3. It's got all these great things. And when did you give that to her? Oh, I didn't. Okay. Number 1, when we create the documents, give it to them. Number 2, don't lie to your lawyer. Holy moly, we're in the middle of a hearing where I've been told that this has been given to the employee. It was never given. So basically, the employee got no notice of any deficiencies ever at any time. And now we're in a hearing. And so everybody looks silly, ended up having to settle the thing. And so if you have the document, give it to them.
Sorry, I just can't help myself.
This is your limit.
Okay, then I'll be good. One of my favorite administrators, you're all my favorites, but I was doing a personnel hearing with this one, and just like Steve, I'd helped write put some punch into the reprimand, and we got to the hearing, and the version that the principal had given the teacher was the nice version. And I'm such a mean person. He was too scared to tell me that. And so I did not find out until the hearing that he'd taken out all my punch ups. And I will tell you, usually I feel sorry for you guys when you're getting beat up on the stand. When that principal got kind of touched up by the lawyer, I was like, that serves you right. I told you how to avoid this and you didn't do it.
See, we told you she's mean. You guys don't believe us. See what she does to us. All right. Are you using the evaluation instrument in policy on file? Okay, we covered that. And here's where that comes from. You are required to submit the revised policies and procedures to the commissioner or designee. So again, you can change them at any time. If you do, make sure they get submitted. Make sure they get approved.
You will have an approval letter. Have that handy now. Don't go searching for that 3 days before the hearing.
All right, what we look and ask for in the personnel process. We want evaluations that state clearly and fairly the employee's failing to meet the standards. And we harp on this. You guys are nice and lawyers are not. And so we like to, as Karen said, punch them up. We want you to be pretty direct and you have to be. I know it's not fun. We evaluate staff here. It's not fun to tell somebody, hey, you're not cutting it. You're not meeting our standards. And I get that. But legally, you have to tell them. Yeah, clear as kind. That's one of our theories. You guys would tell us I was brutally honest, and then you send us these documents, and we're looking. There must be another version because you weren't brutal and you weren't honest because there's nothing in there telling them they're having any deficiencies or having any problems. We're looking for compliance or non-compliance with the improvement plans and directives. And again, just because they read the book they were supposed to read or went to the class, that itself, that's great. That's step one. But did we actually have the improvement we needed? And so we're going to look at those documents to see what were they told, what did they do. Political considerations. This one's always fun. You reach the point when you get through these cases. Okay, everything's standard. You guys have done everything you're supposed to do. Okay, what's the twist? And it's somebody's on the board. The husband, the teacher's husband, is the biggest landowner in town. He's the president of the bank. She runs some organization that's indispensable, and if we fire them, they're going to leave town. All of those types of things, and so we have to factor those in. That's great if we crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, and we have a legally sufficient case. That's fantastic. Who cares if all 5 board members just told you last week she's our favorite teacher? Well, we're not gonna put you through a hearing and embarrass you at a hearing. And so we have to look at all of those types of considerations to decide, are we going to move forward? We have to look at your standing with the board. Let's face it, this year, I think we had more administrative changes at the top of the chain than in any year ever. That can be good, that can be bad. If you're leaving in good standing, but you're leaving, that might be the perfect time to get rid of that teacher that's been causing problems. And give a clean slate to the incoming administrator. Sometimes if you're in bad standing with the board, and we've had this happen, one of my former partners went to a hearing and the board put them through the paces, an entire hearing, knowing full well they had no intentions of firing the teacher. They wanted to embarrass the outgoing superintendent and give him one little last poke in the eye on the way out the door. So that's why we have to look at how are things between you and the board? Are they going to support you when it comes to the time to say yay or nay?
So the good news is we're going to take a bathroom and coffee break. The better news is we've got a list of real life examples of evaluation instruments that drive us crazy coming up next. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thanks. right, we are coming back online. Steve's gonna kick us off again. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so and get rolling.
All right. We often get the call, she's got to go. You've had enough. You've been putting up with it for 1, 2, 3 years, however long it's been. And it's time for the probationary teacher to go. And this is the evaluation document we received. She's so terrible that she's proficient in every single category. Now, there is a theory with the probationary teacher, as we showed, you can terminate their employment for any reason as long as it's not unconstitutional. And so you could have a theory of, yeah, she's proficient, but we think we can do better. We want distinguished. You can try that. We've not had a case from the Supreme Court yet, Nebraska Supreme Court, indicating if that statute really means what it says, which is basically any reason. The problem you run into, though, is when it says proficient, it sure looks like maybe there's some other reason that you're terminating this employee, and perhaps it's an unconstitutional one. So that's the problem we run into. And two, if they're not proficient, don't lie to them. Tell them the truth. And I get it. It's not easy. We talked about it earlier. But if they're basic, they're basic. But generally, I want to see unsatisfactory on that list. I mean, if they truly are not meeting your standard, then they are unsatisfactory. They're not proficient. They're not even basic. They're unsatisfactory. And so you have to be willing to check that box that says they're not meeting the standard. The other one, I think, was this one, Bobby, is this one you got?
Yeah.
This was one, it's horrible. He started crying, but I did it. I marked him down in 3 areas. And now this is one of your fancy new fandangled evaluation instruments that has all these lovely categories with flowery language. What's it, progressing? Is this progressing? I think that's
Unsatisfactory, progressing, proficient, and A is Star Spangled Awesome or something.
All right. Marking them down again to progressing, it doesn't cut it. I mean, either they're meeting your standard or they're not. And so if they're not meeting your standard, you have to tell them. And again, going through all those previous slides we went through, tell them in concrete terms, tell them what you want them to do to fix it. What a teacher sees right here is, I'm doing just fine. I'm not unsatisfactory. I'm rolling along.
No, Steve, you don't understand. Look at how far left those X's are.
I know.
They're so
I know.
close to the unsatisfactory side.
You almost touched the line there. I mean, look at that. That's close. That's close. But Chad Meiskar was a law school classmate of mine and Karen's, and he worked at the Nebraska State Education Association for a long time. And he would tell us, this is what teachers see. If you don't check that unsatisfactory box, they're doing fine. They don't have any issues. Even though we know by putting a checkbox and progressing, they got some flaws and they need to fix it. That's not what they see. That's not what they see at all. And so you have to be pretty darn direct. Now they won't believe you. There's a very good chance of, I'm not unsatisfactory. I'm doing just fine. They can believe whatever they want. You're the evaluator. You're the professional evaluator. You get to tell them they're doing unsatisfactory work, what you want them to do to fix it, and when they're going to fix it. So just make sure that you're willing to check that box, and we know it's hard, but it has to be done.
If you're not willing to check that box, but you're willing to go to a hearing.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about, there's a case coming up later. I call it the cliff. The problem you run into is you have 2.5 semesters of this evaluation. At best, usually it's all proficient. And then in that last semester, all of a sudden everything's unsatisfactory. And you're going to see why that can be problematic in a case we'll talk about a little later.
So this is we don't have a ton of cases where the Nebraska Supreme Court has tackled teacher terminations and teacher tenure. This is one of the first cases after they put into statute the idea that you have just cause protection as a tenured teacher. So this is a PE teacher at South Sioux. She, like a ton of teachers that we hear about all the time, she wasn't that great. She had evaluations that marked her as good or excellent. This goes to Steve's point. I know, because I've worked with you all for almost 25 years, that a good means she wasn't that good a teacher. Good teachers, most of the time, have excellence all down the road. I'm not saying that's how it should be. I'm just saying that's kind of how the culture of education is. Quick footnote. I wonder if it's good for us in teacher preparation and in administrative master's programs that the culture of higher ed in education is to give everybody A's. When I taught school law at UNO, I gave some B's and I had people drop my class because I didn't understand that the culture is everybody gets an A and our differentiation is A minus, A or A plus. And I think the culture of teacher preparation is fighting with the culture of good, solid evaluation, because we're asking you to do something that you haven't experienced, and that you have not, the people you're evaluating have not experienced either. Anyway, so she's marked as good or excellent in all categories until 1975, 1976, where, oh my God, the sky started falling. They marked her as needs improvement in 2 categories: classroom control and student participation. Now, I don't know this for a fact, and I would be curious to talk to the administrators that were working with her at the time. She was also the volleyball coach. I'll bet you good money that the volleyball team started sucking about 1975. That would be my guess. I could be wrong. So she's marked down in these 2 categories, and the board voted to give her notice and to consider termination based on incompetency, neglected duty, inability to control students, or preservation of equipment. Quick footnote. The statute allows for the board to issue the notice. This case is a great example of why we think that's a terrible idea, right? So the board basically bigfoots the administration and they say, we are voting to consider her termination. This wasn't based on the recommendation of the administrative team. Let's see what the administrators thought. Superintendent said, yeah, she's a weak teacher, she's gotta go. Assistant principal says, yeah, sometimes she struggles. I really don't know that I have evaluated her enough to have a clear opinion about whether she should stay or go. Principal, whose name is Dennis Trump, which kind of makes me laugh. I've forgotten. This is why you have to reread these cases every so often. You find these little, comedy gold. The principal, Dennis Trump, says, does not say you're fired. He says, I think she's a competent teacher and I keep her on staff. So we have a too hot, too cold, and in the middle, I don't have an opinion testimony from the administrative team. Board votes to fire her. She appeals all the way up to the Nebraska Supreme Court. Nebraska Supreme Court said, you couldn't find us any place where she's violated a board policy or an order, so you don't have insubordination. You never marked her down as unacceptable. Now let's go back. You all, because I love you all, you think it is, if you mark needs improvement, that means they're bad and they got to go. What this school had was a 4-category rubric, right? Unacceptable, needs improvement, good, and excellent, okay? The needs improvement column is not the worst column on the instrument. There's one below needs improvement. Nebraska Supreme Court said for a tenured teacher, to get rid of her for competency, you never marked her as unacceptable in any area of performance. The fact that she needed to improve was not enough. This is why it makes us so crazy when we see these instruments out there that have things like emerging, progressing, whatever,
Pretty damn close.
just doing a little dance, making a little love, getting down. I don't know what they all do, but we need a category that says not getting the job done. And I don't care if that is part of a 10, sliding scale rubric, or if it's just meets, does not meet. We have to be able to mark the does not meet box. Whatever the lowest box is, you have to mark some of it, and you have to do it with integrity, right? I'm not telling you to lie. But if she's truly not getting it done, you have to be able to mark a document as unacceptable, not needs improvement, which is the second to last. This is a question that I ask all of my administrators in a teacher termination case when we are dealing with competency. The Supreme Court said that nobody testified that this teacher was performing below the standards required of every other teacher. Now, this is weird because evaluations aren't really rank ordered. It's interesting to me that lawyers in law school, they rank us from 1 to whatever it is, 120, like we're all ranked all through law school. And so I think lawyers have this expectation that other professions are okay with this ranking concept. But that's absolutely not the function of your teacher evaluation rubric. You're supposed to be measuring them up against a standard, not against each other, right? But the Nebraska Supreme Court said the teacher was not performing below the standards required of other teachers, therefore she could not be And so this is why, if we go to hearing, I will ask you, was Mr. Truey performing below the standards required of the other teachers? I don't think that means that you can only fire Bobby if he's the very worst teacher on your staff. And if Steve is married to Sister Teresa and we can't fire Steve, that means we also can't fire Bobby. But we are going to have to think about how we answer this question if he isn't your worst teacher on staff, if that makes sense. But that's the Sanders case is where that question comes from when I'm doing your direct. The reason I'm hesitating is I really support the work that the Nebraska Department of Ed has done to try to have some standardization on the teacher evaluation process. I agree that a statewide system or some statewide resources make sense, I mean, to support schools so that you're not all floundering on your own. I don't necessarily love stuff like this that comes out from those kind of efforts because you can see that I don't know what a plan of assistance is versus an action plan, formal evaluation versus observation. I mean, I think this is a great example of making things more complicated than I think they have to be.
This comes from a first-year principal who is new to a district. Now, for superintendents listening or for principals, think if this has happened in your district. Rule 10 requires the people evaluating to be trained to evaluate by their school and to be trained in their policies and instruments they use. Had a call from a first-year principal last semester that said, just got done with my evaluation, want to send it to you. Not only was it not the evaluation instrument on file with NDE, there was a 57-page procedure document that principal had never laid eyes on until he was done with the draft evaluations for every staff member, including one that his superintendent had told him, this person needs to be non-renewed. 57 pages of extra crap that we had to sift through in which we find this. So now do you have to put a plan in place in order to take any action? That's what, like Steve said earlier, a procedure document to a court, to a judge, to a lawyer means something, right?
I would add two things to that. Number one, if you have a 50-some page procedure document, the message you're giving your evaluators is don't fire people. That's that. And I believe, I don't know if we have like any curriculum directors or directors of teaching and learning that are listening in. I pray that you are. I understand that you have tremendous expertise on what it takes to move a teacher from good to great. But please don't forget, my primary goal is moving teachers from bad to out, right? Or from bad to getting another chance at a new district. And if we focus entirely on the idea that you can only move from good to great, you've sent the message that bad teachers just linger here in their own category of never getting moved out. And so that's just, I just cannot emphasize that enough. I mean, and the thing is, when we get those documents, we're exhausted and we're doing one. You're evaluating, however many staff are on your caseload. You're having to do it over and over and over. So this is also from a board policy. You do not have to give an improvement plan. We've just told you that it's not in the statutes, but look at what this Board of Education has done. If a performance clearly does not meet the minimum expectations of performance, the evaluator works with the teacher to develop a plan of improvement. Now what your board has done, now this may be best practice. I personally have my doubts because I've done a lot of teacher improvement plans. But if you believe this is best practice, do you think it's best practice to force a principal to do that and to involve the teacher in the planning process? Because I don't. And at a minimum, understand that you've made a hurdle that's this high by placing that obligation on the principal.
We got a new sheriff in town. If an administrator is new to a district and gives poor evaluations to a tenured teacher, how much do the 10 years of proficient evaluations from previous administrators come into play?
Let's get to Bridgeport too.
Yeah. Legally, I don't think they matter at all. And if we call that a new sheriff in town case, we have them all the time. And I usually just address that head on at the hearing if it goes to hearing. Mr. Principal, you're in your first year. Yes, I am. And did you look at Mrs. Teacher's personnel file before you took over staff? Which I think is a good idea. Yes, I did. I wanted to kind of know where my staff is. And you saw that she has good evaluations. Yes, I did. But your evaluation of her was not good. No, it's not. Can you tell me why not? well, we're adopting Marzano, or the board told me that their #1 goal was to improve instruction, or our test scores were crap last year. So I just own it head on. But the bottom line is the administrator in place that is running the pencil over the evaluation form, that person is the expert. I've even had him call former principals and have the former principal say she was good. And if the board wasn't happy with you, were they, Mr. Principal? In fact, board hired Ms. Young up and comer because they wanted to shake things up. Okay, thanks for playing. That's how I play it. What was I going to say about that? I think that's it. Anything else about new sheriff in town that I should hit? I would prefer that we don't have anything like this at the bottom of the evaluation. In general, I don't think that the principal should be checking the box to say, I recommend they say, or I don't recommend they say. The principal doesn't have that power. If we want to tell them in the evaluation, I really like writing a little paragraph that says, Mrs. Teacher, as you can see, I have serious concerns about your performance. I will be discussing with Superintendent Jones or the HR Director Smith about the fact that I cannot support the continuation of your employment contract. I like putting that in a paragraph. But look at what this is. So here are your choices on this form. We employ for a 2nd or 3rd semester with a 1-semester evaluation cycle.
Wait, we're gonna stop. We can just stop in the middle of the year, Karen. We can just tell them they're fired.
I was gonna say that's not even a choice. That's Kansas. Reemploy next school year with a 3-year evaluation cycle, which doesn't work for a probie because you're statutorily required to do an evaluation every semester for the first 3 years. Reemploy next school year with a 1-year evaluation cycle, which is assistance evaluation. I don't know exactly what that means. Reemploy next school year with a written professional improvement plan, which requires a 1-year or less evaluation cycle, or none.
And at the top, you'll notice it says you can use this in the 2nd or 3rd year. You just can't use it in the 1st semester, which makes no sense.
This makes no sense. I can't even. Are these still mine?
Yes.
Okay, so if you are thinking, okay, how are they going to attack me at a hearing? Here's why I think that's useful. We look at everything through the back end of the telescope, right? We think from the hearing backwards. But I think the more prepared you are for these kind of hearing strategies, the less likely you are to actually draw a hearing, right? You can anticipate the kind of stuff that the NSEA UNISERV rep and the NSEA attorneys are going to ask you about. Then you can bake that into the cake, so to speak, so that you've got those questions answered from the beginning. So number 1, are you certificated to perform this employee's evaluation? Are you the high school principal with a 712 endorsement evaluating an elementary teacher? Now, if you are, we got other staffing issues and we'll have to tackle that from a district-wide perspective, but it's worth asking that question. Did you actually evaluate her, or are you just relying on the work of somebody else? That's fine. Superintendents can descend from the mountain and say, I agree with the principal's assessment of the teacher's performance, but just be ready for the you didn't see it, you don't know, do you? And then the superintendent says, I didn't see it, but I know my principal, trained my principal on the instrument. I have no doubt that Mr. Principal did a great job. This one makes me laugh. If you have a super confusing, super complicated evaluation policy, one of the ways they try to hang that around your neck is say, explain the requirements of the policy to your board. The strategy is to make you look dumb. Another reason why I think having that evaluation policy like on your favorites in Google Drive so that you're in it a lot is really smart. Explain the requirements of Rule 10 related to evaluation. Now you can just pull up these slides and have them right there because we got you covered. This one I love. So as we have seen the explosion of all these criterion across these super complicated rubrics, what the NSEA does now is they count every single box that you've got on the indicators of effective performance, and they make that the denominator. And then they count how many times, remember, not needs improvement, not just good, but how many times you mark them as actually unacceptable. They put that in the numerator, and then they give them a grade. So she's making an 85%. She's passing. Or only 4 out of the 120 rankings was she below district standards. Your response is, that's not how this evaluation rubric works. Every single one of these criteria are the minimum for effective instruction. So our expectation is that every staff member who holds a certificate is meeting our expectations in every one of these rubrics. Now we got to make sure that's true, but that's how you handle that, that This one, I object my butt off when they ask this, but sometimes they think the principal also is in trouble, so they'll say, did you have any needs improvement in your own evaluations? Now, if the answer is yes, here's how you play it. Yeah, I did. In fact, one of the things that the superintendent told me to do is that it was important that I hold staff accountable to the standards that the board has set for instruction. And so just like I'm expecting Mrs. Teacher to do the things I told her to do, I have to do the things my boss told me to do. Good enough. How many other teachers are below district standards? That comes from the Sanders case, so keep that in mind. Have you put any other teachers on improvement plans? They'll ask this if the teacher didn't get an improvement plan, because the idea is that you weren't fair to her. Or sometimes they ask it when they think that you've put a whole bunch of teachers on improvement plans and you're on a jihad. Just be ready to answer and explain why. That one also doesn't worry me. Why did you not put this teacher on an improvement plan? Now, don't say it's not statutorily required, because then they're going to say, well, you're just doing the minimums, you're blah, 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 blah. What you say is this: I did not put this teacher on an improvement plan because her evaluations are crystal clear about what I expected of her. Her evaluations told her the standards she wasn't meeting. I gave concrete suggestions for improvement right there on the evaluation. Things like filling out a seating chart, I didn't think she needed to read a book on that because I told her exactly what to do, and she still failed to do it. Done, right? So just, again, yeah, this one. Don't you think she deserves your best efforts to improve her? The flip side of that is, I also think that she really deserves her best efforts to improve herself, and that in her professional life, she's going to have to learn how to make the effort to get that improvement made herself. So.
All right, any questions, keep texting them in. We're going to keep rolling here because we are getting to the termination process. So we're done with non-renewal. Some of the stuff obviously will overlap. No question. Okay, so on to the termination process. I got the question earlier, is there a difference between the processes you use for a probationary teacher, which would be non-renewed, versus a tenured teacher, which would be terminated? So termination is the discharge of a permanent or tenured certificate employee at the end of the current contract. Non-renewal and termination end the contract at the end of the year. Non-renewal is for the probationary staff. Termination is for the permanent tenured staff. Don't confuse those two.
I have a couple questions before we go too far.
Okay.
Text number one, with the Danielson model, what do you guys want for the marks, for the categories? Do we want just meets expectations, does not meet expectations, or do we want something else?
So the question is for the Danielson model, basically how many, would it be better if it was binary, meets, does not meet, or can we have 4? I don't care if you have 100 if you're willing to check the 100th one, right? That's the short answer. I don't care.
So some of the more seasoned education attorneys really were thinking that if we set meets, does not meet, that would force principals to make a choice. And I totally understand and support the thinking behind that. I don't think 21st century teaching evaluation really is fits to a binary choice, right? Because I do affirm the idea that in addition to telling teachers if they're good enough to stay employed, we do want to move people from good to great or from adequate to good, right? And so I personally, if I was a principal, I would want more boxes, but I would use more boxes. If you're going to have a 5 category rubric and everybody's clustered over here in excellent, so that you think that only very good is, you know, the worst mark you've ever given, we're going to have a problem.
So what we usually say, and what I tell the aspiring principals in my class is, when you're done with your first semester of evaluations, look at your best teacher and your worst teacher, right? In your mind, who's your best, who's your worst on your roster, and compare those two. If they look about the same, you got a problem.
Next question. You mentioned your recommended evaluation form just has the 3 questions from the statute. Will NDE accept that as sufficient and approve it?
I believe so.
They have.
And if they don't, then we'll have a conversation with NDE about what's required in the statute. So again, it's bare bones. We're not saying we don't pimp it out as, yeah, you absolutely should use it, but that's what the statute requires.
Last question. Have you worked with the district to change their evaluation policy to match up with what NDE expects versus what we want?
All the time. And the short answer is, our highest and best use is not to tell you what is the best way to evaluate. It's to point out these things when we go through. So if you don't want to be the bad guy, let us read it from the cynical, this would be used at a hearing. What does this look like when you're explaining it to your board perspective? You do what you think is good and right and what you want to do. We can help with the, sort of the legal, what does this look like practically portion of it. That's it. Okay, so the termination, different. Tenured is that certificated employee that has served at least 3 FTE years or more in the district. What is required for the evaluation of tenured staff? Absolutely nothing by statute. Common misconception. Bobby, it's every year. It's every 3 years. It's every 5 years. It's as necessary. All of those could potentially be true, which is why if you ask a room full of educators how regularly do you have to evaluate tenured staff, you're going to get a range of responses. The misconception is where those requirements come from. So Rule 10 says you must have an evaluation policy for all certificated staff, period. Doesn't matter which certificated staff, that is superintendent all the way on down to first-year part-time teacher. Must include the duration and frequency in there. The statute says for a full instructional period. You've got to articulate for tenured staff how often. Could theoretically be 0. Now that will make it so that it's more difficult to fire them, because how are you going to give them a written list of deficiencies and concrete suggestions for improvement if you never evaluate them? But technically speaking, what the statute says is the board picks, right? So in reality, Rule 10 says you have to establish one, and your board policy has to lay this stuff out. Observation and evaluation as frequently as policy requires. Duration is as long as policy requires, right? So again, when you look at your policies, and we get this question all the time, Bobby, why does KSB have 2 different evaluation policies, one for probationary staff, one for tenured staff? The reason is because they don't have to be the same, right? And in fact, they probably shouldn't be unless you're willing to, in that policy, at least have 2 sections that differentiate. The idea is to make sure that it's clear to the board. We got a lot more say in the tenured evaluation policy. The domains are those required by policy. Again, you'll see that it's kind of a common theme. So you still, though, under Rule 10, right, must provide them with the list of deficiencies and those suggestions for improvement, both written. So again, how do you do that without an evaluation process, including the specific means needed to address them, adequate timeline for implementing. Difference here between a probationary teacher that you may or may not non-renew, where you owe them follow-up evaluations and assistance. That's not in the tenured teacher termination statutes. Remember when Karen talked about the purpose of the probationary period versus when you are a tenured teacher? It is entirely lawful for you to have a 3-year evaluation cycle, right? But if you have a teacher who starts struggling their 4th year in the district, and you're saying, I don't have to evaluate them until year 6, you're obviously going to have to step in and do something, right? So it's not like, oh, this is great, we're going to change it to every 10 years, because that's going to make it harder then for you to address those things. So where most districts fall is somewhere like 1 year, every 2 years, every 3 years. That's typically what we see. Check your policy. This is you?
Yes.
All right, I said earlier we're going to talk about the Cliff. This is our case. This is the Hollingsworth case. And essentially what happened here is the record showed there were 14 written documents, whether evaluations or memoranda to the teacher, all full of praise or very minimal notice of any deficiencies. For the most part, they were 14 positive written documents. January 31st, the principal goes and talks to Mr. Hollingsworth for reasons that are not clear and says, you got to go. You need to resign today. And he goes, no, I'm not quitting. All of a sudden, things change, and he gets noticed up for termination. He's a tenured teacher. As I said, good evaluations, but now the theory is he just doesn't fit in with staff and students, and he doesn't have what they said, well, you left your classroom unattended. The evidence at the hearing was, yep, he sure did one time. He got electrically shocked and had to leave the classroom. And so it's kind of an emergency.
I want to hear the rest of that story for the record. But
he's unable to handle student misbehavior and unable to control his classroom. Nothing in the written documentation. The only evidence was, well, sometimes his kids are out in the hallway. Well, every other employee who testified said, well, yeah, everybody's kids are out in the hallway. So that, okay, he's meeting your standard, because your standard is kids get to be in the hallway. He had conflict with another coach. Well, the conflict was from the other coach, because Mr. Hollingsworth had replaced him as the cross-country teacher. This guy had an axe to grind and was just bitter about the whole thing. Students harassed him. There was some evidence of students harassing him, but it was only after January 31st, because essentially the administration word got out that they weren't happy with this guy and he needed to go. And so students knew that, and they took advantage of it. Parents complained, again, similar. There was nothing in there about parent complaints in any written documentation, and that only came after he was asked to resign. So there's the resignation. The other issue was he had mouth and body odors. They did tell him this. So they actually put this one in writing. His first semester of his first year, they never mentioned it again. And the guy even admitted there, yep, sure did. Just had $1,500 worth of dental work done. And by the way, have you been in my classroom? It's like 85 degrees all the time. And I got to move around. Of course I stink. And so that was that. But after he refuses to resign, now they ratchet up the pressure. He gets more disciplined. They're telling him he can't manage students. They do a student survey a week before the hearing. How do you think that went? And so he just wasn't a very popular guy, and now they're going after him. But everything was positive, positive, positive. You need to quit. No. All of a sudden, everything was terrible and horrible. And so the board fires him. Nebraska Supreme Court said, did you read those statutes? You know, you got to give him a list of deficiencies. You gave him basically nothing. Everything was positive in those documents. You gave him no suggestions for improvement. And they said there's nothing in the record to reveal what prompted the decision to ask for his resignation. It does appear that from that date forward, the administration commenced a systematic and diligent search for evidence which would justify the decision which had already been reached. That search has failed. So the point here is, tell him the truth all the way along. If they really had all those concerns, they would have told him that in the first 2.5 years. My guess is he pissed somebody off in the coaching context and he had to go immediately. And that's how we got where we were.
This case is why when I talk to you, or any of us talk to you on the phone, you say things like, you know, I think he'll resign if I just kind of tell him the truth. We'll counsel him out. Well, whatever. This is, and I think the majority of the time that the teacher does end up resigning, it is better to do the harsh, truthful evaluation and then counsel him out. If you try to counsel him out and then you do the harsh evaluation, it looks like you're a liar, pants on fire. And this case, I mean, that search has failed. I hope that hits home to you, because that's what, and we get this all the time, where you want to talk to them informally and not dirty up their record. You've got to put the stuff in the record for the talk to be effective.
There are 4 reasons for termination. One is just cause, and we're going to go through each of those in some detail. A reduction in force, a RIF, that's another reason you terminate an employment relationship. You can ask them to return a contract by March 15th. You can require them in writing, say, hey, we need something in writing from you indicating you're going to come back. The earliest you can ask for that is March 15th. We're going to talk a little bit about that later, about some of the pros and cons of doing that. But if they fail to meet that deadline, but notice of interest, that first sentence there, the contract of a permanent certificated employee only has a March 15th deadline. Why? Well, because again, a probationary teacher can be non-renewed for any reason, presumably including failing to return a contract on time. And then obviously if they have their certificate revoked or suspended, they're no longer a legal teacher. And so that would be a just cause to terminate their contract. So the 8 sins: incompetency, neglect of duty, unprofessional conduct, insubordination, immorality, which is probably the most difficult one to talk about because judges can't even tell us what it means sometimes. Physical or mental incapacity, which is somewhat misleading. We'll talk about that. Failure to give evidence of professional growth. We're going to talk about that statute a little bit. And other conduct, which interferes substantially with the continued performance of duties. We love this catch-all. There's some things that just don't quite fit the other, or in the alternative, they fit some of the others, but it always fits that last one. They've done something stupid that you just can't have them continue at the district. Some other potential deadly sins that will allow you to terminate an employee's contract: a refusal to submit to a lawfully directed drug and alcohol test. We have drug and alcohol statutes, testing statutes here in Nebraska. If you give a lawful directive for them to take that test and they say no, the statute makes very clear you can terminate their employment. Failing to comply with now it's the Committee on American Civics, the old Americanism Committee. Good news, you've got a whole bunch more requirements, and if a teacher, other employee, superintendent, whoever does not comply with those new requirements, that is a basis for terminating their employment according to the statute. Failing to take the oath of office and pledge. We love these ones. There's an oath of office for anyone using paid public funds. There's cases that say it doesn't apply to schools, but y'all do it anyway.
That's for the board.
Or for the board, I'm sorry. And then this one, the 79-8108, that's for your teachers. They have to take this oath that says they're not communists.
They swear they don't support Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
Is what
yes.
they swear.
And truly, that is what it says if you read today's politics and that statute. The problem is if you force somebody to use one of these, there's plenty of cases that say it's unconstitutional. If they want to do it voluntarily, hey, knock yourself out. But if somebody says, no, I won't do it, I'd be pretty reluctant to fire somebody under those circumstances because I just don't think it's going to pass muster. And then allowing their certificate to lapse, as many of you probably know, the rumor I heard there was upwards of 200 teachers in the classroom this year who did not have a valid certificate because either it had lapsed or they never got it in the first place. And so what are we going to do with those people? And so they, by contract, in almost every single one of your contracts, it says they have to hold a valid certificate. When they don't, they breach the contract.
Here's the rub. I'm not going to go back to the statute. If you look at the termination statute, it says the department revokes or suspends.
Yeah.
It does not address whatsoever what happens if, but I promise, Mr. Superintendent, I submitted this in May. They just didn't get it done by August 31st. There's nothing in the statute that talks about what you can do to the employee that failed to get it renewed, but there's plenty that talks about liability for the board. And I'm assuming your board's going to say that that looks awfully bad on my administrators for making sure this wasn't taken care of.
Says you can't pay them.
Right.
Two things I want to kind of hook onto this. First of all, I call it 7 deadly sins because I was raised Catholic and I don't think the last catch-all counts. So I think 7 deadly sins is way easier to remember.
And I'm a heathen and I can count.
Yeah, but you can't because here's 9, 10, 11. Second, I would, if I were you, if these were my materials, I would just cross out this. This is sort of like fake but true. What is that? True but accurate, accurate but false, whatever. This is true, but I don't think any KSB client should fire someone for not taking an unconstitutional oath. And then last thing on the certificate, teacher certification has employed they're like deploying a new computer system. And it has a name, like all this stuff has names, like AQuest or whatever. So it's got a name. They are not taking any new applications. They're not processing any new applications right now. All they're doing is moving all the existing certificate holders from the old system into the new system. So if you have staff members who are due for renewal this year, I think it's going to be worse this year than it was last year. And if you're looking to hire a baby teacher, like anybody that's applied right now is just standing in a queue because their focus right now is to move existing certificate holders from one system to the next. So I think next year will be worse. Okay, so we're going to now kind of go through the different 7 deadly sins and kind of explain each one of them. And I'm delighted that yes, Mr. Truey.
Because these end up in a notice letter, right? So when you tell us educationally what's wrong, we have to.
That's right. We identify the statutory bases for what the teacher's done. So you tell us the facts. She didn't put learning targets on the board. She didn't turn in lesson plans. She was mean to the music parents, and now they won't help with the band festival. And then we take all that stuff and we translate it into the legal standards. And I loved that I got incompetency this morning because this is actually my favorite reason to terminate a teacher. There are a lot of school attorneys out there over the years that have said things like, oh, competency case, those are too hard, turn everything into insubordination, we don't want to do incompetency cases. I disagree. Listen here, nobody in that boardroom is more of an expert on what competent instruction is than you. You are the certificate holder with an administrative endorsement. You have done however many years of education to learn what good teaching looks like. And this is what we're supposed to be all about. If we turn everything into insubordination, then all we're doing is playing a game of gotcha. And I think the NSCA has some points in complaining about some of the things we expect teachers to do. But if we are focused on core competencies, then that is like what we should be about. That's why we should be spending district resources to move teachers along. So the definition is it includes demonstrated deficiencies or shortcomings in knowledge or subject matter, or teaching or administrative skills. The Nebraska Supreme Court says this isn't measured in a vacuum, but or against a standard of total perfection, but instead you're measuring it against how the other staff members on your staff are expected to perform the same or similar duties. So when your board adopts Danielson, they have set competency that they expect all staff members to meet. And then when you start filling out that rubric for all your staff, you are setting the standard for the person that you're trying to improve by setting out what you expect of everybody else. This is the other reason why I don't think clustering all your evaluations on excellent, except for the bad guy, and putting him as does not meet, is what the standard really is requiring, right? You should have an array of performance so that you're truly measuring what other people are doing, and then you hold people accountable that are falling beneath that minimum standard. So the Schultz case, actually we have this case all the time. I think I tried a similar fact pattern case fairly recently here. This is the elementary teacher that parents hate, right? So she's tenured, she's been in Fremont for, I think I can't remember how many years. And at the hearing, the superintendent says, you know, she's not real warm and cuddly, but she's a competent teacher. The elementary supervisor says, you know, I do have some things I wish she would do better. She needs to work on relationships with the kids, but she meets the bare minimum standards. Principal says, you know, I didn't have a problem with her until recently, but it seems like things have kind of gone off the rails. Here's the real driving force in this case. Elementary parents are pissed. Their kids have way too much homework. Johnny's got a tummy ache and won't go to school because he's still so scared of the mean teacher. The boys in her class actually organized, this is pretty organized for 5th grade boys, organized a mathematics strike where they refused to do the homework because they thought it was excessive. Problem was, principal, elementary supervisor, and superintendent did not tell her, stop giving this homework. There was no one with an education background or a degree or a credential that said children in elementary classrooms should only be expected to do X number of hours of homework at a time. The teacher's argument was, hey, I give time in class for kids to do homework, and if they screw around in class and don't get it done, then they have to take it home. I've heard that from teachers a lot. And the flip side of that, and the reason I need you guys as the educational experts to be able to say this is sending students who are distractible and have trouble focusing at school, sending them home into a more chaotic environment and expecting them on their own to overcome their attentional deficits, that's setting kids up for failure. I mean, that's what we would say in 2020, right? But in 1982, nobody with a credential was able to articulate anything about it being wrong for kids to have extra homework if they were screwing around in class. Nebraska Supreme Court said the testimony of parents were insufficient. They even had taken kids to the doctor, you know, with stomach aches and whatever. And the Supreme Court said those were unsupported conclusions at best. One of my worst moments in a termination hearing was in a school district out west, and we're in like music room. God, I can transport to it in my mind right now. They were calling all these parents, and the parents were actually saying it was a good teacher, not a bad teacher. She was a lazy teacher and didn't give bad grades, so the parents liked her. And I stood up, you know, as a young lawyer, and I said, objection. These people are parents. They're not educational experts, which is absolutely the right objection, according to Schultz. Problem was the entire room like erupted into laughter because the community thought that was the stupidest thing any dumb lawyer from Lincoln had ever said. So you have to be careful about how you say this, but legally, so here's what you do as a principal. If you've got a ton of parent complaints, you don't say, I'm firing this teacher because of the parental complaints. You say, these complaints caused me to look into the practices that this teacher had in the classroom. And based on the complaints and my independent examination, it seemed to me, in my professional opinion, that her homework expectations were unreasonable, and so I told her to cut them down. That's how you handle a parental complaint case in compliance with Schultz. Here, the fact that this principal gave her above average ratings during the entire time she taught, the court says we're at a loss to see how Mrs. Schultz could be found to be incompetent. So I'm not afraid of competency. I love having like a copy of Bloom's taxonomy blown up and have the principal like explaining what higher level thinking is. We know a lot, like APL strategies have a lot of like very understandable things to lay people that teachers that are good should do. I love having a conversation with you in front of the board about good instructional practice, but you can't just say the parents were mad and so now she's going to go out the door. So here's some examples. Refusing to attend meetings, especially meetings with where you're getting professional development and learning things. There's a case that we're going to talk about where he refused to leave his office And the superintendent had said, hey, you need to stop secluding yourself, and he still hated all of his peers, so he would leave the office. He refused to work collaboratively with the staff. Those are all examples from the Robinson case about incompetency. I would add, here's what I have on my incompetency, lesson plans that don't include specialization or customization or individualization for kids with special ed needs. Failure to post learning targets. I know a lot of you have a requirement that you post a daily learning target. If they don't have it on the board every single day, that's incompetent. Failure to deploy APL strategies. If the board is paid for the staff to have APL training, you darn well better be using a bell ringer and think time and wait time and all that good stuff. Failure to use higher level thinking and only asking basic questions of recall. Failing to having a teacher-centered instead of a learner-centered classroom, right? All of that stuff that's really interesting and fun and exciting when you go to training on good instruction. Teachers that don't do that are incompetent.
All right, neglect of duty requires evidence of something more than occasional neglect. So in other words, the Supreme Court is going to look at your "she was late twice" argument and probably laugh at you a little bit, right? Evidence that a particular duty was not competently performed on certain occasions or occasional neglect of some duty or performance in itself doesn't necessarily get you there, right? So it's got to be something more than, Bobby, she's abusing her sick leave. Why? Because she's taking it, right? That's the problem. So examples, discrepancies related to the teacher's curriculum orders that had to be rectified by others. This is another thing Karen will talk about in the Bridgeport case. Lying about curriculum orders, exchanging inappropriate and unprofessional emails when you should be working, talking about the President of the United States when you should be working, right? The First Amendment hurdle isn't in our list of reasons. We're going to have to say your political discussion, which was not protected by the First Amendment, exemplified that you were neglecting your duty. Also constitute incompetence. In many of these cases, you'll see there's a lot of overlap. So the primary thing in the Davis case is you got a teacher, and the difference between this case and the one Karen talked about earlier where you had the three administrators, one was too hot, one was too cold, one was in the middle, is the administration in this case had noted to the teacher, hey, you don't have good classroom control, you're not doing things the right way, you have a general obligation, right, as an educator, to be able to control your classroom. That's not written down somewhere exactly what it means, what I see when you're controlling your classroom. I'm just telling you that you're not doing it. So they recommend termination at the hearing. The superintendent and principal testify. Clearly, this person is not doing well enough to be here at Callaway. Everybody else testifies in support of the teacher, right? So you got a bunch of parents and other folks saying the superintendent and principal are just off their rocker. The Nebraska Supreme Court said, look, this is not like the Sanders case. Because in this case, we had unified expert witnesses. Notice that, right? You are the expert witness, just like Karen noted. You're the one that's in charge of doing the evaluation. If you as the expert say they're not meeting standards, and they line up 10 teachers that say they are meeting standards, you are the expert witness, right? We can prove a legally sufficient case even if other people disagree with you, if your administrators say, yeah, not meeting it. The important thing in this case is the Supreme Court said, you don't have to at the hearing say our standard is X every single time, especially when it's difficult to prove. What you've got to say is whatever X is, that person's not meeting it, right? So that's the different one. Their expert opinions were sufficient as a matter of law. I'm gonna read that out loud.
So question, neglect of duty. What is the best way to document this? Do you need to have the teacher sign every instance you document?
Document it every time in my world, not because you can't testify to it, but because that's just an evidence question, right? If the teacher was late 15 times and you say, yeah, I happen to know that because I remembered these 15 times, that doesn't mean we haven't been able to prove it. It just makes it easier to prove if you document it. Would you have the teacher sign it every time? In my opinion, absolutely yes, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it demonstrates that you don't end up in Steve's position where you have somebody saying, I'm pretty sure I gave it to her, and then she says at the hearing or he says at the hearing, I've never seen that. So a signature not for agreement but for acceptance is a good idea. The other reason is, as we talk about here in a little bit, their personnel record, personnel file statute says the teacher can put in a dispute, basically provide a written response to anything in their personnel file. So we give this to them in September saying you were late 5 times. That's part of the reason for a termination of the tenured teacher at the end of the year. The question of, well, but I told you I disagreed. We can now look back and say, you had the opportunity throughout this year to disagree with anything I put in there, and you never did, right? So there's, I think, those two reasons.
All right, unprofessional conduct. This is always a good one. These are the fun cases you guys call us about. So what is it? It's conduct which breaches the rules or ethical code of a profession or conduct which is unbecoming a member in good standing of a profession. Pretty straightforward. It does have to be directly related to their fitness to act in his or her professional capacity. So it needs to be job related in some way. So the Johansson case, this is why I can't be a teacher, because this is unprofessional. So we got two special ed kids. We got a tenured special ed teacher, and he decides that he's had enough with, I think it was Jacob and Craig. And both, the one had cerebral palsy, the other had some significant behavioral issues and was on the spectrum. And so there's allegations that he mistreated the student. He put soap in the one kid's mouth. He shook the one student so hard his glasses almost fell off his head and his head's bouncing around. My favorite is he takes the kid with cerebral palsy. Now, there was a dispute as to whether he actually wrapped the kid up in the extension cord or whether he allowed others to wrap him up. Anyway, the kid ends up tied up with an extension cord. The kid had to hobble down to the office to call his mother to please come untie me. Good Lord. Threw the one student out of class and said, yeah, go ahead, go over to that other school. We won't miss you. And then they were in 5th grade, so he takes him to the 4th grade classroom, opens the door, and he says, take a look at them, Craig. Those are going to be your classmates next year if you don't shape up. Not probably the best way to handle things as a teacher. So the board terminates him for unprofessional conduct. And I know what you're thinking. Steve, why are we talking about this case? Nobody's going to appeal this case. Not only does he appeal to the district court, he wins at district court. The district court writes this 30-plus page opinion that really went off the rails, and you're wondering, what in the hell are you talking about? So that obviously gets appealed up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, not surprisingly, says, are you kidding me? That's plenty of evidence to terminate somebody's employment. And they did set the standard for us, because there was a question as how much evidence is enough? And they said if a judge could not word the trial to a jury, direct a verdict. I won't bore you with all the standards, but you're well below any criminal standard. And you're well below, quite frankly, a civil trial standard with that kind of evidentiary standard. The other part that they let us know is that admission of hearsay is not error. What's that mean? Anything that was said outside the hearing can come in. It's supposed to be given little weight, but it doesn't have to be given no weight. So it can come in and it can be considered. And they said to determine whether conduct is unbecoming, even though not a violation of an explicit rule or ethical code, we look to the opinions of educational professionals. So what does that mean? Any teacher could give their opinion on this topic. Any administrator can give their opinion. You hold a certificate from NDE in the teaching world, you can give your opinion on whether something is or is not professional. School teachers are normally expected to be able to determine the type of conduct which constitutes unfitness to teach. So they can't go with, well, you never told me I couldn't slap a kid. Well, no kidding, we did. There's a lot of things we didn't tell you. We don't have to give them every single specific type of example. Unprofessional examples. The big one these days is grooming. This is one place where the Nebraska Department of Education is way ahead, I think, of a lot of places. They have clamped down on grooming. They know what it is. They recognize it, and they obviously don't approve of it, and are getting rid of a lot of these teachers who are in the grooming practice. There's been a lot of it in the news, and so we've got at least 4 bills currently in front of the legislature that are going after teachers that participated in some sort of grooming behavior. There's a bill that would require us to have a policy addressing it. There's a bill that would make it unlawful for an employee to date a student after they've been out of school for less than 6 months. I'd kick it up to 2 years if it was me, but 6 months is a start. And so it's obviously come to the attention of the unicameral that this is an ongoing issue. And then corporal punishment, one of my favorites. Corporal punishment, as we all know, is unlawful. There's our statute. It's prohibited. Not defined in the statutes. We finally had a case in 1999 that told us what it was. It's the infliction of bodily pain as a penalty for disapproved behavior. So if there was no pain, it's not corporal punishment. If it wasn't inflicted for disapproved behavior, it's not corporal punishment. For example, a kid's about to light something on fire, you tackle him. That's not corporal punishment, no matter how much he hurts. You were trying to stop a fire. It wasn't for disapproved behavior. You're trying to maintain order. And so we have, we'll take a little sidestep here. LB 147 is Senator Groney's bill to try to address the Daly case and put it into statute. It amends state law, which would authorize physical intervention, and another provision would be added to authorize reasonable physical intervention. Why there's a difference there, I don't know. I like to say we can now use unreasonable physical intervention because, we're
from Detroit.
So yeah, and I'm from Detroit. So, but it would require you to adopt a policy. I like the amendment 1803. This version is much better, I think, than the original version. I'm very much in support of teachers being able to address these little violent little kids that are interrupting your day, the teacher's day, the other student's day. They drive me nuts. We're there for education, and these kids interfere with that. So it would require you to remove a kid from class upon request if the teacher had followed the policy that you've set up. The concern is there are special ed and Section 504 exceptions. It may swallow the rule in that either the kid has a special ed IEP or a Section 504 plan that's addressing these things, and you're not going to be able to remove them from class. Or they should have one of those things and they don't, in which case we have a different problem. But in either event, most of those kids that are behaviorally disordered, that exception is going to gut this ability to remove that kid from class. The goal is to return kids to class as soon as possible after you put in appropriate interventions and supports. Begs the question for a special ed kid, even if you were able to remove them from class, do you have to have an IEP meeting or a 504 team meeting and put additional supports in place? Kind of an unanswered question. A big piece that I think is good for teachers, I think it'll make them a little more brave, is you can't go after them criminally, civilly, administratively if they use this process. So if they follow your policy, get a kid out of class, they can't be liable, they can't be criminally convicted. And I hopefully that will embolden some teachers. The issue I have with this is even if this bill doesn't pass, you have the authority and the ability to take reasonable physical action. We've got a statute that says you can take whatever action is reasonably necessary to aid the student, further school purposes, or prevent interference with the educational process. The Daly case specifically said you can use physical contact short of corporal punishment to the degree necessary to preserve order and control in the school environment. So you have the ability now to physically restrain, respond to these kids. Take a look at your restraint and seclusion policies and make sure you're complying with those. But short of that, you have the ability to deal with these kids now. So.
Okay, we are going to take you notice we're taking 5-minute breaks today and not 10 because we're trying to keep things clicking along, but we also want to break this up appropriately. Then we're going to come back and finish up the reasons for termination. My goal and prayer would be we get that done by 11:30, 11:40, and then we spend the last 20 to 30 minutes talking about kind of that catch-all stuff at the end. So if you're looking at the material saying, well, you know, are they going to get through it all? Yeah, but we will hit some of it more heavily than others. And then do text your questions as you come. I don't think we'll leave time at the end for questions because everybody at the remote sites just leaves. So our plan is to talk right up to the time, but to have it all be worthwhile time. So we'll see you at 11:10. Okay, we are back and rolling, and going through this section on what the 7 deadly sins, because Steve's not in the room right now, so I can say 7 deadly sins. 7 deadly sins really mean in practice. So I talked about incompetency, and then I said don't fall in love with insubordination to the neglect of incompetency. I think these two are kind of sister sins. Because if you say post learning targets on the board every day and the teacher doesn't do it, he's either incapable of doing it, in which case he's incompetent, or he's just refusing to do it, in which case he's insubordinate. So insubordination, the definition is the absence of subordination or submission, resistance to or defiance of authority, refusal to obey orders. I don't love the whole, I don't know, especially educators get weird about like subordination and submission and whatever. The definition I use of insubordination, like when a teacher is being cross-examined, is you cannot substitute your judgment for the principal's judgment. If you and the principal disagree, his or her judgment is the one that has to carry. Usually insubordination, to prove it, you have to have evidence of a policy or a directive which they failed to follow. You can't be insubordinate like just in a vacuum. It has to be in response to something. Turn in your lesson plans by 5 o'clock on Friday. I turn them in Monday at 8. That's insubordinate. Turn in your lesson plans on Powers or Infinite Campus, and I just don't do it. Insubordinate. I don't dislike insubordination, and I usually have an insubordination component in all my cases. Don't try to write plans to create insubordination, because I think that's when the union's criticism of holding teachers accountable starts to feel more legitimate to me, because I don't want to trap teachers into insubordination, if you know what I'm saying. Immorality is actually one of my least favorite reasons, because I don't know what's immoral in 2020. I crack open the internet and I don't know. There is no statutory definition. Some courts have tried to define it. This quote, the term immoral has been defined generally as that which is hostile to the welfare of the general public and contrary to good morals. See, I read Donald, I read Donald Trump's tweets and I'm like, I don't know. Not confined to sexual matters. Sometimes we think immorality is only sex because we've all been raised in sort of a, Protestant Puritan kind of approach. It says it does include conduct inconsistent with rectitude or indicative of corruption, indecency, depravity, dissoluteness, or willful, flagrant, shameless conduct showing moral indifference to the respectable members of the community. So I think being drunk at school, for example, is immoral, even if you're not having sex while you're drunk. I think stealing from the school is immoral, even if you're not stealing to fund your porn habit, But immorality is hard to get our arms around.
Does that mean there's a community standard to immorality? Because
I do not want to be standing. My mom grew up in Greeley, right? They drink in Greeley. Is it immoral to be at a high school graduation party as a teacher and be drunk if everybody else is drunk? I don't know if that rule is different in Henderson than it is in Greeley, right? Those are issues I would just assume not tackle. So I don't usually rely on immorality all that much. But you guys do call about them, and here are typical calls that we get. How about a staff member having an affair? Is it immoral if you are married to someone and you're having an affair with someone else? To me, if the spouse is not on staff and the paramour is not on staff, I'm having trouble seeing how that has a connection to school, so I worry about that. Now you say, hey, Karen, we're like a super conservative community. Everybody knows. Okay, we can give it a whirl, but you do have a constitutional right to freely associate in matters of your personal and family. I'm nervous about that. Now, if we can say your wife keeps calling and yelling at the secretary to keep track of you, or your paramour keeps sending you dirty texts all day long during the school day, now we got something, right? Because we have conduct which interferes with the performance of your duties. But if it's just people gossiping, I struggle with that. How about a DUI? Is it immoral to get a DUI? I also struggle with this one. I have sometimes tried to hook it to if you have coaching duties. So coaches are charged with enforcing a strict anti-tobacco, anti-alcohol policy for kids. The union pushback is it's illegal for a 15-year-old to juul. It's not illegal for my coach to have a DUI, you know? So I do struggle with that. Here's what the Nebraska Supreme Court has said. And this is the N-word case, where a teacher in Omaha Public Schools used the N-word in front of students twice. And the Supreme Court said, in order for conduct to be immoral, it has to be related to your ability to teach. And I question some of this stuff, but what were you going to say?
No, just this is the idea. So you can't say the N-word in class because obviously that's going to be impactful to those kids in your class that are black. It's going to be impactful to everybody else. But what if you say the N-word in a bar on Saturday night?
Right.
This is where we don't know to the extent to which the First Amendment overlaps and sort of the culture being able to say whatever the hell you want now on social media, whatever way you want it. When they talk about the ability to teach, is that the skill, right? Or is that 20 parents?
If you say the N-word in a bar and parents hear it and they start picketing the school, now is that the opportunity?
Right. So yeah, they're a great teacher who said something really stupid is different than, right? They are clearly lacking the skill to understand that you can't say this sort of stuff. So it gets back to this notion of competence versus insubordination versus, and you got the First Amendment. So a couple of examples.
Was I talking too long?
No, this is good.
Okay, good. Sorry.
Subjecting minority students to racial epithets. That's the case Karen was talking about, right? That's the N-word case. So here's the question. In today's day and age, right, this is what at least some courts have said about it, right? It must be considered immoral to teach white students that it's all right to engage in conduct which is humiliating, painful, and harmful to individuals, which subjects a class of people to public disdain and ridicule. So for example, you've seen us use this before. If your staff members have a dress-up day on Halloween and go as the border wall, and a second set goes as Mexicans, what does that mean? Are we functionally telling students, especially minority students, Hispanic students, right, that we are treating them with disdain and ridicule? So we run into all sorts of weird complications when you talk about morality versus the First Amendment and all the stuff Steve talked about. If it happens at school, doesn't happen at school. And it's just really difficult to sort through these, especially when you think it could be a community standard, right? When Karen talked about, does it offend the people in the community? So this is one of the things that we always point out when we come and talk to school staffs. When all this stuff started blowing up in Nebraska, when you had Americana nights, and we had those terrible things that were being said to schools that had significant minority populations, the commission, and you got these crazy teachers in Utah that are dressing up as the border wall and Mexicans that had the good sense not to post the picture of the Mexicans behind the border wall, but obviously posted these two things on social media. The commissioner steps in and says, everybody take a step back, right? This blatant regard for human dignity, call it whatever you want to under the First Amendment. I view this as a Rule 27 violation. In other words, it goes back to that idea that are we basically saying to a group of students, right, we have disdain and ridicule toward you. So I don't envy anybody sorting through it. What I will tell you is it's a lot more complicated politically and legally than some of you think. We got to talk through these types of cases. So examples, engaging in aggressive sexual misconduct. Things like multiple assaults on school grounds have obviously counted in connection with a school activity. And so those are the sort of things that we worry about for immorality. Was there a question or just, okay.
All right, these are probably my least favorite cases. They're not fun. It's physical or mental incapacity. We're talking about people that are maybe early onset dementia, cancer cases where they're refusing to accept reality that, you know, they can't perform the job anymore. And so it's not specifically defined, which can be problematic. We do have these other laws that give us some guidance. The problem is it says physical or mental incapacity, whereas the American with Disabilities Act talks about a physical or mental impairment. And oftentimes, you all know when you do the interactive process under the ADA, somebody can be given a reasonable accommodation and still perform the job. Incapacity is saying they can't do the job, period, no matter what you do. And so these other laws are helpful in getting us there. And we certainly have to go through all of these things before we get to incapacity. And FMLA talks about a serious health condition. Again, they'd have to be incapacitated for us to be able to use this statute. The work comp provision can get a little icky. You know, for those of you who've gone through it, you're kind of in limbo for a period of time. They really don't know when they're going to get better. And so, yeah, they're incapacitated, but if you go too soon and try to fire them, they can sue you for retaliation under the worker comp statute. So that's a delicate balance. So when you have those situations, it's best to get the lawyer involved and try to work through those. The examples, yeah, the teacher with cancer. It's just not fun when you have these. They've used all their leave. They basically are asking for indefinite leave. When can you come back? I have no idea. That's not a reasonable accommodation request. You don't have to grant that. You can, you don't have to. And at some point you say, you know what, we need a math teacher and we got to get somebody in there. So that's when these aren't very fun. We got a teacher who can't stand or walk for more than 30 seconds at a time due to a bad back. That could be incapacity, but we, say elementary teacher versus high school teacher. An elementary teacher, probably, especially kindergarten, preschool, you're going to be picking up kids and doing a lot of interacting. That may be incapacity, whereas a high school teacher, quite honestly, if they can walk to the back of the classroom and back to the front to supervise and do it in 30 seconds, it may not be an incapacity type situation. So those aren't any fun. Here's the lack of professional growth statute. This is one of the reasons you can terminate the employment. And basically is you have to give 6 semester hours of college credit must be accepted. You have to do that. So what is it? Otherwise we get this call out. What is it? Whatever you say it is, pretty much. Whatever the school board adopts and says counts. That you can use that towards professional growth. Other conduct which substantially interferes with the performance of duties. This is our catch-all. I love this one. A lot of times, if it falls under one of the other categories, it also falls under this. Is it more appropriate for the DUI? I mean, think about that. We have those anti-drug and anti-alcohol policies and messages that we give to our kids constantly. And so, okay, maybe it wasn't immoral, but certainly it has to interfere with your duties when you're speaking out of both sides of your mouth, especially if you're a coach. And so it probably would fit more under this category than any of the others.
Sorry, I was tweeting. Okay, so the termination process for like due process, how the school board hearing looks. Oh, I gotta stay behind the mic. The termination process, thank you to whoever texted that to Steve. I'll be good. It looks very similar for termination than it does for non-renewal. The statute calls termination a formal due process hearing. We've kind of formalized the non-renewal process to the point where it looks very similar to contract termination. I will tell you that if you're dealing with a member of the NSEA, for non-renewal, they will send a UNISERV representative, not necessarily an attorney. For termination, they will get an attorney. That doesn't make me scared. The NSEA's attorneys are very, very good, but they also know what they're about. And so if we've done all of the predicate pieces right, having an attorney represent the teachers doesn't make me more afraid than dealing with a UNISERV representative. So here's the statute. It tells you that what we have to do. We have to notify them at least 5 days prior to the hearing about why we're taking this action. If they request, we have to give them a list of witnesses and exhibits, which they always request and we always give to them. I usually write a summary of what the witnesses will say, but technically by statute, you're only really required to list the witnesses. They have a right to bring an attorney if they want. And they have a right to cross-examine witnesses and examine documents and put their own evidence in front of the board. So it's formal. We do have to comply with the Open Meetings Act, but that's okay. Everybody's got a lawyer. So you usually have 3 lawyers in a termination case, 1 for the administration, 1 sitting with the board, 1 with the teacher. We do evidence, we do cross, but we do that for a non-renewal as well. Here's the other big difference. Highlight this on your materials if you got a highlighter. It's not just a majority of a quorum, it's a majority of members of the board, which means you got to have 4 votes to terminate on a 6-member board, which gets hinky if you've got a 6-member board and you lose a board member to having some kind of family connection, or because the board member has publicly expressed a view that the teacher should be fired, or that's why they're running for the board. Now we're down to we're only able to lose 1 vote, if you see what I'm saying. So you got to have 4 votes. And then we do all this. We reduce the findings to writing and do all that. Again, notice happens to happen before April 15th. Just like with the probies, they've got 7 days to request a hearing. Again, the matter has to be confidential. Still send the memo out to the board, but you can't tell the whole world. Conduct the hearing within 30 days unless we agree to extend the deadline, which the NSEA always does. It's a formal due process hearing. It has to be for just cause, majority members of the board. I just told you that. This one is also tricky. Don't forget, have to be decided by May 15th. I have had a couple of districts miss that deadline. Even if you notice somebody up and they don't request a hearing, The board still has to take a final action by May 15th. So this doesn't happen if we're helping, but sometimes we have homegrown stuff that gets weird. So that's the process for termination.
All right, on to contract amendment. So if you, in the statute, obviously you've seen multiple times, if you're going to, terminate or amend or non-renew or amend, one of the things you can do as the board is amend a contract. So for a probationary teacher, you can amend it, and for a tenured teacher, you can amend it. The fact of the matter on contract amendment, though, is we typically are only talking about it for things like reduction in force, or when you've given your FFA ag teacher 25 extended contract days and decide that, we need to go down to 15, and that person says, no, I don't want to lose 10 days of pay, I'll do the work. That would be a basis for a contract amendment to remove those extended contract days. This is not extra duty, right? So again, this distinction between coaching basketball and performing more teaching duties, that's extended contract. Don't get those two things confused. And do not put your extra duty assignments in your teaching contract. Because arguably any amendment to the teacher's contract is required to go through due process. So that's why we say use an assignment letter. You have a contract, that's awesome. Here is a 2-sentence letter that says you're the basketball coach, good news. Here is a 2-sentence letter that says, we're not doing very well, you're not the basketball coach anymore, good news. None of that has to do with their contract and the due process we've been talking about. So keep those things separate, that's the main thing. This is a question we get all the time. Bobby, our teacher contracts are like 30 years old, we need to update those. That's great, we're happy to help with that process. You have several options, but here's what you need to understand. Making wholesale changes to teacher contracts is amendment of contract, right? That's just the truth. So again, the initial contract in the teacher's file could be the contract that they have forever. So this idea that, we give out new contracts every year is not required, as we'll talk about at the end here. So understanding that the contract that teacher has in his or her file may be the only full contract that they ever get. If you're updating your teacher contracts, you'll either have to get the teacher's approval of that, and there's a process that we can talk through, or you're going to have to give them notice of amendment. So we want to change it. We want to add a provision that says they have to report crimes in 24 hours to their contract. So if they don't do that, they're in violation of their contract. That's great. What we typically say is don't amend 75 contracts, put that in the negotiated agreement, right? That's one of the main things here to remember, is that contracts are automatically updated through collective bargaining. So be thinking about why it is that you want to update contracts, and we're obviously happy to talk through what those options are and consider those wholesale changes in your collective bargaining agreement. So real quick, some of the other stuff in the tenure statutes about the other possible actions. If you remember from last year, there was a bill introduced that said, you will have a right to grieve any improvement plan that's given to you, right? And so we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But it was going to be added to this same statute that talks about the other actions a superintendent can take with respect to a staff member. So you can suspend somebody without pay. You got to give them a formal full due process hearing. So the downside is I want to give them a 30-day suspension because they've engaged in some misconduct. It's probably going to be the exact same hearing as you'd have to give them if you actually fired them, right? Canceled their contract for that misconduct. Administrative leave, which we use fairly often for a variety of reasons, is leave with pay, right? Which you can impose on any certificated employee pending a decision to cancel their contract. Allegation of teacher and student exchanging nude pictures. We say to that teacher, you are going on administrative leave, in part because we plan to give that teacher, if that teacher doesn't resign, notice of cancellation of their contract. You can also use it for other certificated employees for an indefinite period, so long as you don't take away their pay and benefits and force them into an adverse employment action. What I see fairly often is we're going to give you a 5-day leave in a reprimand document because you said the F word 3 times in your class, right? That 5-day leave has to be paid unless you want to give them notice. They can't agree to an unpaid leave as part of settlement of that consequence. But administrative leave generally is leave with pay. Okay, so you're not giving notice. We're going to talk about non-renewal and termination unless there is a question.
Got a question for you? Our contracts have included extended contract days and was added for positions through collective bargaining. Can be taken out with new contracts?
So the question in my mind is this. If you have something on your extra duty schedule, that is different, separate and apart, totally legally different under the York versus Neal case, than adding extended contract days or an addendum to the teaching contract that says you have 10 extended contract days. The stuff that's in your salary schedule, your extra duty schedule, coaching, speech, senior class sponsor, those have no due process rights. So those should absolutely not be in your teaching contract. But we are going to redo the English curriculum this summer. We've talked to the 3 English teachers, ELA teachers in our school, and we're going to give them 3 extended contract days. That's teacher curriculum work. Those can go in the contract or be attached as an addendum to the teaching contract itself. Those should be considered part of the teaching contract. Coaching and other extra duty assignments should not be. So if you have any of these, the coaching assignments or extra duty assignments, I say get those out of there.
Okay, I have a question for either of you. On average, what would you say a district might expect to spend for a non-renewal, for a termination? What are your thoughts on offering a buyout to avoid a hearing?
About $1.75. No, that's our joke number here when things are too expensive. A non-renewal, I mean, any of them, whether it's non-renewal or termination, anywhere I would range from $10,000 to $30,000. The issue you run into when you do buyouts, sometimes are totally appropriate. The issue you run into is twofold. One, sometimes you get a reputation of being a board that pays money and you're afraid to go to a hearing. And so they know they can extort you a little bit for some money. 2, sometimes, frankly, you have a staff that's a little out of control. It's not just this teacher, it's the whole staff is being insubordinate in a way. They think they're in charge. They think the administration's incompetent. They don't have any respect for the board. Sometimes it's worth every penny to have a hearing to put everybody on notice that, hey, there's rules, they apply and they apply to everybody. And so sometimes it is worth it. I mean, well, let's face it, you can spend anywhere from 8 to 20 hours next to our smiling faces, worth every, well, except for his. I wouldn't pay that to sit next to Bobby. But for the other 2, yeah, it'd be great. But no, truly, sometimes there's a reason to do it. And it's not a good idea to settle. And you need to send that message to the staff and the community.
I had one where the superintendent really didn't want to go to hearing. He offered the teachers $64,000. I remember the number because I thought it was so outrageous. Teacher said no, got fired, got nothing. And you know what? They haven't had a personnel hearing, I don't think, in the last decade. So.
And the other piece that we've seen is after a hearing. Now it can go, it's a double-edged sword. It can go in both directions, but we have seen after a hearing, I didn't know all that was going on. Holy crap, that guy was terrible. Yeah, because we're not allowed to tell you anything. When's the one time we can? At a public hearing when they ask for it. And so the information gets out and it kind of cleanses the palate a little bit of, oh, you guys are doing your job. Excellent. So that would be my reasons for going forward. Okay, improvement plans. The thing I say every single time, the number 1 purpose for an improvement plan is to make the teacher better. It is not to fire the teacher. It is not to paper the file. It's not to make them jump through stupid hoops. If that's your goal, it's just inappropriate. The whole point of it is to make them better. Now, the byproduct of that is if they don't get better, you have fantastic evidence to end their employment because they're a bad teacher. So just remember the motive counts. You can't do this just because make one of those plans that makes them jump through hoops and then we can fire them. No, that's not, you truly have to make a legitimate effort to make them better. That's the whole point. It's non-statutory. We've said that repeatedly. Improvement and remediation are required. You do have to try to make them better. You have to lead them again to the water. But a separate document is not required. You could put it in the evaluation. You could put it in a separate document. You can put it anything you want to call it. I don't care. But if you're going to go down the road of remediating, we generally do suggest you do it in writing so that it's clear to everybody what was required and what did or did not happen. And again, and let's check the board policy. Sometimes you guys put those requirements in there. It is an extension of the evaluation process. We're trying to make them better. This will help you meet Rule 10 requirements. Why don't we want you to do those stupid plans? Here's why. There is the impression by some, including the NSCA, that all you do with these plans is make them 100 pages long and make them stand on their left foot and bark like a dog on Thursday at midnight. And if they don't, you're going to fire them. That is not the point of these plans. If you're doing that, stop it. And because of that impression, we got this bill. And what it was going to allow them to do is grieve an improvement plan. So you are statutorily obligated to remediate and make them better and give them guidance on how to get better. You do it in writing. Now they get to grieve it. Well, that's fantastic. And at first I was a little irritated with it. And I said, well, that kind of stinks. That's going to add some problems and some procedural hiccups maybe, and just a lot of time and effort that, in my opinion, would be wasted. But the more you think about it, like I just said, when do you get to tell the board about these things? When it gets to them. You can't just tell them to tell them. There has to be a hearing request or something along those lines. This is an awesome vehicle. Get it in front of the board. And then we get to, okay, who's right or wrong? The board, the teacher or the administration? Is your plan appropriate or is it not appropriate? I'm putting my money on you guys. I've seen the calls you make to us. It's not for the teacher who's good and you just don't like them. It's for bad teachers. And so I will gladly put their dirty laundry in front of the board. Can't wait. It'd be great. And if that's the way they want to approach it, that'd be fantastic. Now the board knows, now the community knows, and we'll let the chips fall where they may. We'll see whose side they end up on. This was a quote from them. We support the bill because administrators also must be held accountable for providing support for teachers who are struggling. I agree with that. I don't disagree with that statement at all. It's your job. You are required to help them get better. To succeed, teachers need administrators who will exercise their own teaching skills with a sincere desire to help those struggling teachers improve. Sort of. Again, this is you can lead them to water. You can't make them drink. I mean, there's only so much you can do. And so, yes, it is your job to help make them better. No question about that. And so I would do it in writing, do it with the improvement plan. The hardest part of these is I think it's as much or more work for the administrator than it is for the teacher if you're doing it appropriately. You do have to do follow-up evaluations. You do have to have meetings with them and let them know you're doing this better, you're not doing this better, and go through the process. Do everything within your reasonable powers to make them better. And so it does take time and it does take effort. Let's see, again, not statutorily required, check your policy. In some cases, it's pretty rare, but there's no requirement to remediate. Imagine a teacher stabs a student. You got to remediate that? No, obviously. But where is that line from there down to they don't post their objective on the board, right? They don't tell the kids what the purpose of the lesson is. Okay, somewhere in between there is a line. Where is it? Criminal conduct is often the line. We don't have to tell them not to be a criminal. You don't have to remediate that. This one, they discovered a teacher's sexual misconduct. They were 5 years old. School fires them, and the teacher's argument is, well, you didn't remediate me. I mean, how ridiculous. We didn't tell you not to sexually assault kids, and then we didn't put you on a plan to make sure you didn't do it again. And obviously the court said that's ridiculous. So there are times, but don't make that assumption because sometimes it's not as obvious as you might think, but typically it's in the criminal type context. And again, the burden would be on you to prove that you couldn't fix it. And so that's why we want to be pretty careful on that. Be prepared to answer why you use an improvement plan in one case, but not the other. And there are times when it's appropriate to use a separate written plan for one and not the other. Sometimes there are so many issues you have to get them down, or it's such a major issue you have to get it down in writing. Other times it could be as simple as a verbal directive. Knock it off. Don't do it. There's not much more required there to remediate that issue. And so, but you have to be able to give a reasonable explanation as to why you did it in one case and not the other. This is a biggie. You guys call us a lot and say, we need help with these plans. We need to make them better. I kind of get frustrated with you guys sometimes. You're the educators. I mean, I can put the legalese and the boilerplate stuff in that needs to be in there, and that's appropriate. But it's your plan. It's your district. You guys set the standard as to what is and is not required in your district. You guys you've got to get your fingers all over that plan and make it yours as to identify the issue and what you really think is going to help fix it. And you need to make that yours so that you could honestly testify if it ever came to it. Yeah, I think that would have fixed the issue. I identified it. I gave them a deadline. I gave them all the assistance I could give them to fix this. That's what we need from you guys. So we really need you. Don't take a form plan. Don't reuse the one from last year or from the neighboring district. Make it yours. And you could truly testify truthfully and honestly that you did everything you could to make them better, and it really was your plan. Deadlines, use them, give them. It's part of the requirements. We do have to give them directives as to when they need to finish things. It'll seem obvious at times, but you really have to do it. I mean, Karen's example earlier was perfect. Here's specificity. Lesson plans must be timely. Well, we all know what that means until we get to a hearing and they go, I have no idea. I didn't know it was 4:30. So I would even go further. We've got lesson plans for each week must be received by the principal no later than 4 o'clock on Friday for the next week. And you better say where or how. because we had a teacher put him under the windshield wiper of a teacher or of the principal. So I turned him in, I put him under your windshield. Well, who the hell puts him under a windshield? And so, you know, they weren't there when he got there. You get in this big dispute. So do you want them in your mailbox? Do you want them by email? How do you want them? Do they have to be on your computer system? Clarify, specify, and make clear so that there are no disputes as to what's there. Meeting your own deadlines. I like to say you're going to meet with the teachers. Karen gets a little hinky about that sometimes, especially if you say, well, we're going to meet every 2 weeks. Well, what happens when you meet every 15 days? Now you didn't meet your own day, you know, and the NSEA starts to parse those apart and things like that. Yes, you should have meetings, but if you were going to set deadlines on yourself, you have to meet them. You have to. It's the same standard you're imposing on the teacher. So don't impose impossible deadlines on yourself. They have to be reasonable if you're going to impose them. It's pointless to use these if you don't provide enough time. Again, you have to provide them sufficient time to improve, period. Don't February 1st all of a sudden start on classroom management when you plan to give them a notice on March 15th. That's not enough time. I mean, and obviously the type of issue is going to drive how much time you give them, but don't be looking a week or two in advance to give a directive and then when they don't fix it, move on, even unless it's one of those obvious ones where it only takes that verbal directive. So just be careful about that.
So whatever the LB was last year. Oh, behind the mic. The bill they had put in front of the education committee last year that was going to allow teachers to create plans kind of got my Irish up because they were taking my name in vain, and somehow the Teachers Association got a hold of some of the materials that we gave you guys last year as like a sample, and they were acting like that was a plan that someone had actually gotten. And so I guess, how do I say this? There is nothing wrong with seeking assistance from your attorneys to make sure that you have written a clear plan that helps somebody get better. I do think it's wrong if you're going through like that sample that we gave you last year, which I think had, I don't remember, 17 or 18 different sample directives, and you're just going, oh, this will get them and that'll get them and this will get them. That's not really what we're about. We're about being clear as kind, about giving them clear goals and telling them what to do to get better. So that's one thing. Then the other thing that kind of troubled me about that whole legislative process last year is somebody who's not from an education background, but who's a member of the education community. Someone had brought an improvement plan to a legislator, and this person who's involved in the education community said to me, Karen, it was kind of illegitimate. They were making him do a book report. And I was like, 100%, there is nothing wrong with telling a teacher, read this book, prepare an artifact showing what you learned from it and identifying how you're going to apply it in your classroom, and then we'll discuss it. I mean, that's called education, my friend. And so the disconnect between some members of the education community and like what I view as normal for teachers getting better, it really made me rethink kind of what we're doing with improvement plans. So if you're going to have a teacher read, and I'm really interested in teaching and learning, so I read a bunch of this stuff, and I have these, you know, books that I like that I have, you know, in my hopper to like suggest as examples that you can require. But if you've never read a John Gordon book and you use the energy bus as something that teachers should use to get to become a better team member, there's a disconnect there, right? And so if you're not somebody that can read a book and thinks that's reasonable, then you shouldn't assign it. That's my point. So this is the model that, like, when I put together a plan or help you put together a plan, this is the pattern that I follow because I think it hits all the bells and it seems fair to me. So in your classroom, I saw that it was chaotic and you had poor classroom management. No later than, and pick a deadline before me, April 15th, April 1st, I need to come back into your classroom and find it to be orderly and well managed. You can go to the ESU and do this training on MTSS. You can read this book about love and logic. You can use I don't love the clip up, clip down, because there's stuff now about how that's not good and shaming to kids, but you can, if you like it, you can, you know, so we give them some stuff to do, whether it's a book to read, a course to go to. You tell them, I will be in your classroom frequently and see how you're doing. And if you don't get this done, you know, you won't be able to continue on here as a teacher. To me, nice, clean, tidy, clear. But so the resources piece, I think we need to be more thoughtful about. The other thing I'll quick say, and then we got to keep clicking along. The other thing that you love to do is say, the resource is, I'm going to send you to this other teacher's classroom to watch how she does it. That is useless unless you either record that class or you go and observe the class with the teacher. Because otherwise the teacher that's struggling cannot watch a good teacher and see what they're doing. A good friend of mine, next door neighbor, her daughter is a first-year teacher, and the daughter's kind of struggling with classroom control, and the mom is a longtime veteran teacher. So mom was visiting daughter's classroom, and one of the little boys was being naughty, and the mom, she says, she looked at the little boy and went, and the boy immediately sat down and was good. And the daughter said to the mom, "How did you do that?" But see, a struggling teacher can't necessarily see a veteran teacher do it and then know how to do it themselves. So the mom kind of explained what she did. That's what you need to sit beside them and say, see how she made eye contact? See how she, just gave him a silent cue? See how he responded to the fact that she was doing it with confidence and not explaining to him why he needed to do it? That's what they need. They need you to sit beside them and explain what they did. Regardless of your format, always include the written deficiencies, remember, because that's statutorily required. Always include written concrete suggestions for improvement, because that's what Rule 10 requires. I love to link it up to educational practice, and so that's where I love Danielson and Marzano, because we do have research-based practices behind our suggestions. Tell them what you expect to see a successful implementation of this plan look like, and not success is reading the book and writing the artifact. Success is implementing strategies in your classroom to keep students more engaged or to improve classroom control or whatever. Always include the assistance and resources you're going to give them. That can be right in the evaluation. It doesn't have to be a freestanding evaluation. Always give them deadlines and consequences for failure. Teachers, is this still me? Teachers do have by statute the ability to respond to any item that you put in his or her personnel file. So you can tell when they've talked to the NSEA and the NSEA helps them write a response. I have no problem with that. Write this down. If you ever get a response from a teacher, never let the teacher have the last word. Always you write a response. And it can be something like, I've received your response and you're right. February 14th is a professional development day. Your new deadline for turning that stuff in will be the following Monday. No problem, but you write it down. Don't let the teacher play gotcha and that be the last word. And typically and we'll help you write a response if you it's easier if you've done a few of them to kind of hear the music. I love saying, I was pleased that you care enough about your employment to write a response, but I was disappointed that you chose to quibble with my evaluation of your performance, and then we're off to the races. So, but always get the last word.
Yeah, and part of the reason we put this in there is if you look at when we help prepare plans, we encourage you to put at the bottom a paragraph that says, if you disagree with this, within 7 days, come tell me, and put your disagreements in writing, right? Because although the statute would allow them on day 8 to still attach a written response, if we're 6 months later at a hearing, and 2 weeks before the hearing is when they send you a written response that says, I dispute all of that stuff. One of the things we're going to say is you cared you disagreed with what we were telling you to do to improve so much that you waited for 6 months, right? That's part of why we do it, is we use this and say, we'd encourage you, if you dispute this plan, let us know, right? That's one of the things that we do. So the quick down and dirty on reprimands. The reprimand process, candidly, is one that we help with fairly often, if for no other reason than there are pretty strict statutory requirements for written reprimands. So here's a distinction. An oral reprimand is contained in the statute. So the statute that says you can issue a reprimand and that you can give an unpaid leave and all that stuff we talked about before says that one of the 4 things you can do short of a termination is an oral reprimand. It is legally significant. It can be no different than knock that off, do better at that, make sure little Johnny has his shoes tied when he leaves the classroom. That is an oral reprimand, right? So there's no doubt that is something that you can do. But there is a difference between documenting an oral reprimand that you've given, I told the teacher that little Johnny trips and so needs to have his shoes tied, and issuing a written reprimand. The reason is because there are statutory requirements for issuing a written reprimand. Number 1, before issuing the written reprimand, you have to confer with the teacher. So you have to say, little Johnny has tripped 3 times in the hallway. I told you before that you needed to have little Johnny tie his shoes. What do you have to say for yourself? Here is what I'm proposing. You're going to get this written reprimand. You're going to have a suspension. You're going to have a checklist, whatever it is that you're going to put in there. Give them an opportunity to present their version of the facts. They have the ability then, once you issue that reprimand, to contest it. So the teacher can actually grieve a written reprimand. So a teacher can go all the way through your grievance procedure and your negotiated agreement for the written reprimand that says, tell little Johnny to tie his shoes. If there's no grievance procedure available, for example, if you have a school site that's not covered by your negotiated agreement, they can challenge through the chain of command, which is going to look an awful lot like your grievance procedure. There is no mandatory format for these documents, but we like to provide you a template because you must include the notice of the appeal rights they have, and you should include the other components that we've talked about for any good documentation. So we've got sort of a sample that you can follow, fairly straightforward. Same as what Karen said before, there's no mandatory method to use, but this notion that here's the facts, here's the rule, this is why it's bad, the impact, the specific directives to do better, and your knowledge of it by signing below is one of the things that we can then use when we put that in front of your board to say, yes, I told the teacher signed for their agreement. They had 7 days or whatever your grievance policy says to grieve it, and guess what? They never did. So we use that fact to our advantage. So when you don't believe the teacher, you have to say so. If you do believe the teacher, you should say so. If you aren't sure what to believe, you should put, even if the teacher's version is correct, X, Y, Z, right? So make sure that your documentation is clear, and think of this as something that your board is going to read when they're deliberating, and they're going to look at as part of the personnel hearing. So when you're unsure of the facts, admit that uncertainty, right? Say that I asked you, it's not clear, but even if what you're saying is true, you can understand how this would look bad. Posting about the president and calling him a fascist when you're sitting at the basketball game because you're pissed off at people wearing MAGA hats may or may not be First Amendment protected, but be mindful of what that means to members of our community, right? That's the sort of thing that you can do. And these are your documents, right? Use your opportunity to present the information the way that you want. Always respond, as Karen said, and make sure that if there is a response written, typically speaking, the NSCA does get involved and helps write responses to some of these things. So just be prepared for that. Don't take shortcuts in an investigation. Don't rely on hearsay without other investigation. At a minimum, you got to talk to the teacher, but don't ignore hearsay. Oh, Bobby, I heard that she dropped the F-bomb 3 times in class, but it was all hearsay. Hearsay is a rule of evidence. It is not a rule of documentation. Let us worry about whether that hearsay is significant for proving a legally sufficient case later. This isn't an episode of Law and Order, right? Take the documentation and put it all together, and let's talk about what that means. Don't, right, fail to document. Got to confer with the teacher. So if you show up at the same conference that you're going to get the teacher's side with the reprimand written, that looks like you weren't going to care about what the teacher said. And most of the time in those meetings, they give you something else, right, that you can use to put in there, or they will agree what you should put in the reprimand. So, okay.
All right, contract cancellation. This is the one, these are the juicy ones, the good ones. Somebody's hit a kid, somebody's sexting or grooming or doing one of those things. We're going to end the contract right now. We're not waiting till the end of the year. And so here's the grounds by statute. A lot of them are very similar or the same as those for termination. The ones I'd point you to are B and C, breach of any material provision of the teacher's contract or administrator's contract for any reason set forth in the employment contract. So you can, on your employment contracts, put down, you know, there's a question on a first DUI. Can you fire a teacher for a first DUI? There's case law on both sides from different states. We don't have an answer in Nebraska. Congratulations, put DUI in your contract. You can fire them for it. And so give some thought to, are there particular issues that aren't clearly listed there that you would want to be able to terminate somebody's employment for? If so, put them in the contract. Here's a typical contract provision. It says the teacher will abide by the district's and administration's policies, rules, regulations, and directives. So if they don't follow your directive, this says you can cancel their contract. That's one of the reasons in the contract. This is a similar one. This is a provision. This is, again, similar, but we add in the any other conduct because that's not always in the just cause definition. It's under 2 different sections. So we make sure it's included in the contract so that it's always included. But again, you can expand this list as much as you want it to do by statute. You just put it in the contract. So that is always an option. One of the questions we get asked about is, okay, wait a minute. We had stuff. Yeah, he accidentally walked into the girls' locker room 5 years ago. Now he's done something stupid this year. Do we get to use that old stuff or do we not get to use the old stuff? And the NSCA would often argue, no, it's got to be from this current contract year. You don't get to go back into the past. I've reprimanded him several times for cursing in class, for the last 6 years. Do I get to use that old stuff? We just realized he's been stealing forever. It's been, all last year, but we just found out, do we get to use this? And this is Karen's going to, I won't steal her thunder, but she'll give you the answer.
I'm actually going to click through this pretty fast. This is my case, and it was a great case, and I'm going to stand behind the mic. But we've got the facts in here that you guys can read on your own. I don't have to bore you with my war stories. Bottom line, it's kind of a combination new sheriff in town and a staff member that the rest of the staff just can't handle. He appealed to the Nebraska Supreme Court. I can't remember how many bases for appeal. It was like 10. It was ridiculous. It was a lot. And so like some of his arguments were, you can't use a hearing officer. You have to just do it on your own. You can't have a lawyer sit with the board. Supreme Court said no. He had done a bunch of stuff to try to bias the board. Supreme Court said no. Here's the point, this bullet point right here. The Nebraska Supreme Court said, we are not limited to only considering misconduct in the current contract year. If you were a jerk this year, you were a jerk last year, you were a jerk a year before, that's cumulative. Right? I call this the Don Truey rule because Bobby's dad says a skipping stone eventually sinks. And so all those skips can count against him. He doesn't have to just do it all in 1 year. So sometimes you guys struggle with that. This case specifically says you can consider prior year's misconduct to take action this calendar year. And the good guys won this one. Supreme Court said he was incompetent and insubordinate. And so here's the bottom line. They can consider past conduct, especially when it's intertwined, and you can use that to determine if the contract should be canceled. Is this me still? Yeah. So here's the bottom line. Most of the time in cancellation, it's a crisis situation. Call us or call your lawyer, whoever it is. We don't expect you to do cancellation on your own. That makes us nervous. Here's a summary of the process. So if you want to go back and reference how that works, you'll have this in your hot little hands.
All right. Briefly on mandatory reporting, because this has been a big one that's come up. And candidly, some of these are close calls, especially when you have an allegation that, yeah, they were Snapchatting back and forth. I don't know what was exchanged, but it certainly makes me feel uncomfortable. I heard it was nude photos. Full stop right there. I heard this teacher was exchanging nude photos with that student. Bobby, I have absolutely no proof. There's no screenshot. They both deny it vehemently. What do I do, right? And the answer is we got to think through at least two different mandatory reporting requirements. The first one is obvious and has hit the news. You will remember the case of the principal from OPS that was allegedly told about all this inappropriate touching by an elementary school teacher by staff, yet failed to report that. So he goes in, right, for his criminal interview with his lawyer sitting there, and he's asked questions by the prosecution. So the detective, his name is Jeff Shelburne, asks Mr. Nelson, the principal, if people told you about all this stuff Sedlacek was doing, why didn't you get rid of him or put somebody else in the room to supervise even if you didn't call us? So he leaves that cliffhanger, the detective does, stands up and walks out. In the small conference room, the principal slams his fist on the desk and says, God damn it, why didn't I do that? This is nightmare stuff for us, right? Because this has now been basically paraded all over the state. There are people in the unicameral that think we don't do enough to report. You got to post the hotline in your school and all this stuff that they can gin up, when really what you have here is a principal that should have reported, sure, but about a half a dozen teachers that also should have reported that didn't get charged criminally. So everybody's got a vested interest in this. We got to make sure that we get it right. The two main things when we get calls about staff misconduct that we worry about, number one, child abuse, and number two, Rule 27. So I'm not going to belabor the point of child abuse. We wanted you to have the full statute in here so that you can refresh yourself, share it with your staff, do whatever you want. You'll also have a policy on reporting. If you don't, you should. But the child abuse reporting stuff talks about when you've got a reasonable cause to believe it may have occurred. This is the important one for the booming, right, factual scenarios that we get all the time with respect to inappropriate communication. We've had 3 or 4 Snapchat allegedly exchanging inappropriate messages at best, nudes at worst cases, this year alone. It is child abuse to encourage for any person, right? So boyfriend, girlfriend are committing child abuse and they say, send me nudes, but a teacher or any staff member is committing child abuse if they encourage a kid to send a nude photo as well. Don't even have to get one. Encouraging a kid is child abuse, so you have to report it. But really what we struggle with are these Rule 27 required reports. For a public certificate holder, there are only 3 sections of Rule 27 that require you to make a report. Number 1, you've had your license revoked for cause, right? If it's been issued in Nebraska. This is the important one. I'm going to go to the third one real quick. You can't represent your professional credentials. So if you say, right, I am a principal and you're not a principal, that is actually a mandatory report by the person who got that information. I am a teacher, but they're not actually certified anymore. Misrepresenting those things even on a resume, you got to report them. Here's the big one. Shall not commit any act of moral turpitude. We talked about that. Nobody knows what that means. What does it mean to be immoral? Good luck. But I know grooming is immoral because Brian Halstead says even if it's not a felony or a misdemeanor, it's immoral. Look at the second part. If they engage in any felony conduct, teacher says to student, send me a nude. Student says, no, I'm not going to do it, and reports the teacher to you. Do you have to report that teacher to NDE? The answer is absolutely. Because it is a felony to solicit child pornography. So it doesn't say convicted of felony, right? It says engage in felony misconduct. So if they engage in any act of moral turpitude, engage in any felony conduct, or are convicted of abuse or neglect misdemeanors, you must report. That's where these cases get really tricky, right? What is moral turpitude? What is a felony? Because you're supposed to know what every felony in Nebraska is, right? And report that. So there you go. There's Rule 27.
All right, reductions in force. We just put this in here for a quick note. The big one is, if you have a bad teacher, fire them for being a bad teacher. Do not use the reduction in force process. One, the NSCA, if they believe that's what you're doing, will fight you tooth and nail. Two, it's cheating. And three, people who get riffed have recall rights. So they get to come back for a period of 24 months if you have an opening they're qualified for. So just don't do it. That's the biggest piece to this. So what you do in a reduction in force, you're reducing an area or a program. The board determines that first. And that can only be after a material change in circumstances. Having a bad teacher isn't it. It's a loss of money, loss of students, something along those lines. And it requires a reduction in force. That's our standard. Who the RIF affects is based on your policy, and it's not always who you think it's going to be. I want to RIF him is never that simple. It really isn't. I mean, if you RIF the shop program and he only has a shop certificate, maybe it's him. But often they have a hidden endorsement you've forgotten about that it's not the teacher you think it's going to be. So don't, if you're gunning for somebody because they're a bad teacher, then do it. Do a termination, do a non-renewal for cause, not a reduction in force. It's just bad news all the way around. Teacher renewal resignation. General ways to renew, you can do nothing. You just sit there. That's it. As we said, April 15th comes and goes, it rolls over. You can do a new contract. Does it require administrative or board approval? I think if you're doing a new contract, I think it does have to be the board. That's by statute. Renewal agreements and letters, again, same thing. I would have the board approve those. Confirmation of term documents. These are interesting. Basically, what's being sent around, they're cool spreadsheets, and it lays out all the terms and the new dollar amounts and all that. You send them out by email typically and say, hey, if these are wrong, let me know. And then the problem is you kind of got that limbo time period. What if they don't object until September 15th? But anyway, that would be one of the options. Doing nothing, it's easy. You don't have to do anything. The negotiated agreement fills in any change terms like salary. The negatives, you don't get to lock them into April 15th. That goes in both directions. So if you've got an FFA or an ag teacher or something that's kind of a hard position to fill, you might want to lock them in earlier than April 15th. You don't want to be surprised on April 15th and have them tell you they're leaving. The new contract, I like them because you can find that full contract. All the terms are there in one place. If both sides are agreeing to a change in the contract, it's easy to do. And again, you've got that 1 month period where they can return it. The negative part, don't get greedy. Some of you will try to change the entire contract, make them sign it, and that's just going to get us into a fight, and we don't want that. Questions about knowing involuntary changes, that's related to the previous one. Must be approved by the board to lock it in. Yeah, I think it does. Renewal agreements and letters, as it different from letters of intent. Letters of intent are just that. They're not binding on anybody, so don't get too whipped up about those. But renewal agreements and letters, again, you can require those to be submitted earlier than April 15th and lock people in. The negatives, you can allow mutual updating of terms, but it's more difficult to find the full contract. It makes amendments more obvious, which can be good or bad, depending on which side you're on. And again, it would have to be approved by the board to be locked in.
So I know we're a little bit over time. We'll be done in less than 5 minutes. And I usually pride myself on being done right on the nose, but this is important because the Voice, I haven't seen it yet, but every year the Voice publishes a little article that says, don't let those SOBs trick you. When they send out letters of intent, you aren't required to sign those before March 15th. They are correct. We cannot lock a teacher in to sign a contract before March 15th. Is a letter of intent a contract?
that's what the fight is going to be about. So don't think that by sending a letter of intent on, February 15th that you got them, right? You cannot require a teacher to commit any earlier than March 15th. And that's, we don't very often cheat, and I don't like it when the union perceives that we cheat, because it's not good for us. It's not good for anybody to think that you can't trust your administrators. Just the dog's breakfast for a couple other things we want you to know about. Remember, the Neal case says coaching is not teaching. So if you're going to pull someone's coaching and keep their teaching contract in place, they don't have due process. I had a question texted that said, okay, I don't give new contracts, but each year I send them their salary and their coaching pay on just a freestanding piece of paper. Does that link the two together? I don't think so. I don't think that's a full contract. You're just telling them, like, you're doing the math for them for what it's going to look like for the next contract year. But I do agree with Bobby that you shouldn't put the coaching in the contract itself. But simply sending a salary, something to memorialize what they're going to get paid next year, that's not a contract.
And the difference between here is a factual sheet that I'm giving you, tell me if you disagree, and here's a factual sheet, confirm it and sign it and return it by March 15th is exactly what we're talking about.
That's right.
This idea of doing nothing and letting the April 15th deadline be your rule is okay, but you have the same document, add a signature block that says due by March 15th, and now you've got a renewal
Turn it
agreement.
into a contract.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's right. Do check your policy. We're big fans of having the superintendent assign extra duty sponsors and not having the board approve it, but there are some boards that still are adamant that they want to sign off on that coaching. We worry about board bias. This is just the quote from the Johansson case. They have to have apparent impartiality. We're going to continue to do board training on this issue, but here's that language so that you can have it to share with your board. Last thing, do be careful about teacher file or staff member file confidentiality. Notice that it's not just teachers, it's also any full-time employee. No person except school officials while engaged in their professional duties can access the file, and the contents shall not be divulged. So if I'm working over Bobby on an improvement plan, I can't show the board the improvement plan. I also can't say, board, I have put Bobby on a plan because I want him to get better because I know you guys have some concerns about his performance. You are now disclosing the contents of Bobby's personnel file, violated the statute, as well as jeopardizing the board's impartiality. We always scramble to get through all this and want to make sure it's new and different. Sorry that we went a little bit over, but we do want to make sure that this is one of the most important things you do as a building principal or as a superintendent. So I want to make sure to give you time to get all the stuff that you need.
Send any other questions. Otherwise,
This will be recorded and up on our website. I'm in a school this afternoon, so it'll be later than normal, but we will get it posted probably by tomorrow at the end of the business day. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.